be live streamed. I'm going to read some points from the protocol. Please only speak when invited to by the chair. If you wish to speak, please raise your hand and direct all communication via the chair. Please ensure that your mics are muted when you're not speaking. When speaking, please be succinct and do not exceed the allocated timeframes highlighted at the start of the hearing. If you're referring to a specific page or picture in the report, please refer to the page number. If you are having technical difficulties, please use the chat function. Any persistent disruptive behavior will result in removal from the meeting. If there is more than one application, parties are advised that after each application is heard in turn, as set out in the agenda pack, the subcommittee will not retire after each application. Applicants and all other parties will be asked to leave the proceedings after their items concluded. Once all applications have been considered, any remaining parties will be asked to log out of the hearing. Please do so promptly so that candidates have the opportunity to deliberate and make a decision on each application. Each party will be notified of the decision within 5 working days. Please could I ask the subcommittee to appoint a chair?
Nominate Councillor Peters.
Can I second that?
Thank you very much. So, thank you everyone for being here today. We have 2 items on the agenda. Well, 2 substantive items on the agenda. We have the renewal of a sex establishment premises license at the Old Act 69 Hackney Road, and the application for review of premises license off Broadway, 66 to 65 Broadway Market. More general on the agenda, we also have gone through the first item, which is the election of a chair. The second item is apologies for absence. Do we have any apologies for absence?
There are no apologies for absence.
Wonderful, thank you very much. And then there is a declarations of interest. Do we have any declarations of interest from any of the members on the panel?
No, Chair.
No, thank you very much. If people have a pack of documents either online or in or a hard copy, you'll see that the 4th item is the licensing subcommittee hearing procedure. If you flick through the pack, should be a little bit later on. I will bring it up myself. I can find it. In any case, while we're doing that, it might be helpful for us to go around the room and see who is here. For the purposes of everyone here, I'll introduce myself. My name is James Peters. I'm a councillor in the Beauvoir ward, and as I said, I'll be chairing this meeting. Could the other members of the panel introduce themselves?
Hi, I'm Councillor Clubier. I sit in for London Fields ward. I'll be hearing the first item on the agenda, but my place will be taken by Councillor Pajama Thomas for the second item.
And I'm Councillor Penny Root. I represent Victoria ward. I'll be here for both items.
Thank you very much. And the officers, if you could introduce yourselves.
Peter Gray, Governance Officer.
Good evening. I'm Subhash Reid. I'm our Principal Licensing Officer. Amanda North from Legal Services.
Thank you. So we have a number of other people here. Who do we have for the for the Old Acts item?
My name is David Forbes. I'm Mr. Melody's solicitor, and it's Mr. Melody sitting alongside me.
Wonderful. Do we have anyone else for that item? No? Okay, and then for the off-Broadway item.
I'm Gareth Hughes, barrister representing Mr. and Mr. Selby on the second item on your agenda?
My name's Robert Gardner. I'm the Enforcement and Business Regulation Manager for the London Borough of Hackney. And I'm here for the Broadway matter.
Wonderful. Is that everyone on the call? I suspect not.
I'm Oliver Tompkins. I'm next door neighbour of Broadway. Broadway Market.
And Mr. Tompkins, did you send in a representation?
I did.
Do we know which one is yours? There are quite a few in this pack.
Sorry, Chair, it's on C3 for the off-Broadway.
I think they're numbered E, aren't they?
Oh no, Oliver Thompson is for the second item for the off-Broadway. We don't have any other interested parties for the first item.
Okay. But sorry, it's C3, did you say?
It's just C3
C3. Okay.
for the second item off-Broadway.
Yeah. Anyone else?
I'm Ryan Grocock, also a neighbour of Off-Broadway.
Do we know which?
C1.
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 I'm PC Kerry Ryan from Police Licensing Unit.
Cool. Thank you very much. Anyone else?
Louise Brewood, representing London Fields Safer Neighbourhood Panel and a large number of residents.
And
For item 2.
Item 2. And had you written in a representation?
Yes, very detailed.
Do we know which one that is?
C4.
C4, I think.
C4.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's Rupert Selby here.
Yep.
For the second item, I'm one of the licensees. I have a number of people at the bar in Off-Broadway at the moment who'd like to join later, who are represented in the list. I can give you their names, but it was easier to assemble them in one place rather than to have people joining, because that tends to bring these calls down.
Yeah.
So they're all in one link. I prefer to have them join later, otherwise they're going to get confusing with noise. I can give you a list of names if that would help now.
No, I mean, that seems sensible. I think that what I'll take advice from the officers here when we get to that item about how to deal with that. But I think for the purposes of right now, that makes sense for them not to join now. So thank you very much for letting us know. Okay, so we should probably kick off with the first item, the old axe item. For that, this is the renewal of the premises license. Mr. Forbes, are you speaking to us on this?
I'm sorry. Say again.
Oh, is Srimana?
I have to present the report, Chair.
Sorry. Yes. Off you go. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Licensing Service received an application back in March 2020 to consider the renewal for 2020 to 2021 for the 6th establishment venue license under the Local Government Miscellaneous Provision Act 1982 for Eildor Acts 69 Hackney Road, as stated within the report. After the consultation period, we have received representation from the interested parties. The premises license holder has submitted an additional information which has been circulated. I have nothing else to add. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. In which case, I can't find the meeting procedure in the papers, but I assume that Mr. Forbes now speaks to this item.
Yes, I'm happy to do so, Chair, if that's what you'd like me to do.
Yes, please. Yeah. For up to, I think, 10 minutes.
Yes, it won't take anywhere near that long. Chair, when this matter was originally before the committee, I think on the 9th of December, and it was postponed until this meeting today, in anticipation of that meeting, I lodged a detailed written submissions. I'm hoping that you and your fellow councillors have had an opportunity to read them, because that will mean that I have to say a lot less.
So we received a number of pages earlier today. and we have all had a look through those. So I think you can probably assume that they have been read. Is there anything in particular that you wanted to draw out from those that submission?
No, I will simply summarise what is said in that. It's set out in more detail in that written submission. Effectively, what it is this: there were visits by licensing officers to the premises on, I think, the 4th and the 9th of July of last year, at which they found breaches of the coronavirus regulations. The point that I sought to make in those written submissions was that, as you no doubt recall, the government had originally announced that all such restrictions would be removed on the 26th of June. In fact, shortly before that date, the date for the removal of those restrictions was postponed until the 19th of July. And these two visits fell more or less in the middle of that period of the extension of those restrictions. What happened was that Mr. Melody was intending, obviously, to remove the systems which had been put in place to deal with those restrictions in anticipation of their removal on the 26th of June. However, shortly before that, there was a domestic crisis involving a member of his family. He was effectively forced to leave the premises where he normally resided to go and stay in Bishop Stortford for what turned out to be a period of some weeks in order to look after his young grandson, whose mother had had some mental health collapse, and he was needed in order to look after the child. He relied upon the staff who managed the premises to delay the removal of the restrictions, which of course they should have done. And it wasn't until after the visit of the licensing officers, which took place during that period of his absence, that he discovered that they had not done so. They'd gone ahead and removed the restrictions precipitately because they had not paid attention to the fact that the date had been delayed. Mr. Melody was penalised for his carelessness in that regard. He accepted the penalty and he paid £1,000 fine as a result. Of course, the restrictions were removed certainly about 10 days to 2 weeks after the licensing officer's visit, so that what had been happening when they did visit would no longer have been an offence against the regulations had the original date stood, or indeed had the visits taken place after the 19th of July. In my submission, therefore, that is a matter which should not be held against him to the extent of refusing the application. Those restrictions have, of course, as we all know, have long ago been removed now, and it would seem unlikely to ever be reimposed, so that this situation is unlikely to ever arise again. There were further complaints about the behaviour of the dancers in an upstairs private dancing area, and that is something, again, of which Mr. Melody wasn't aware, although he should have been. But having it brought to his attention, he has done several things to ensure that there is no repetition of it. First of all, he has closed the upstairs dancing area where these incidents were taking place, so that dancers are no longer allowed to go up there. The private dancing area is now restricted to an area on the ground floor at the end of the bar, which is regularly supervised by Mr. Melody's door staff or members of the bar staff. And so consequently, any dancer who was tempted to engage in activities which are prohibited by the license would be stopped from doing so. So that so far as that is concerned, again, with those measures in place, there is unlikely to be a repetition of breaches of that nature. Chair, there are other matters referred to by the objectors who put in their objections way back in March 2020, when this matter would have come before the committee were it not for the pandemic. The point that I would make about those, which again is set out in my written submissions, is that these are a repetition of objections which had been put forward largely by the same people during the previous annual renewal in the year before, and the committee considered those objections and decided that they were not of sufficient weight in order to refuse the renewal on that occasion. And in my submission, therefore, they should not be of sufficient weight to do that now. The only other new matter which is raised relates to proceedings which were brought against Mr. Melody for a breach of fire regulations in relation to a different public house which he then owned in the Bishop Stortford area. Mr. Melody had put this property up on the market and was up for sale at the time this occurred, and he had done so about 2 months previously. The pub was no longer operating, and so consequently nobody was coming onto the premises, no customers were there because it was closed. He accepts that even so, the regulations required him to maintain these precautions against fire, and he had failed to do so. There was a very small fire as a result of a log rolling out of a fireplace, which the fire brigade attended and very quickly extinguished. Mr. Melody pleaded guilty to an offence relating to that. That is an offence which often is treated very seriously and can carry a lengthy sentence of imprisonment. In fact, Mr. Melody was fined the very modest sum of £1,000, which no doubt reflected the matters that I have just referred to. Although this matter is raised by the objectors in relation to this application, in my submission, it carries insufficient weight for you to see that as a ground for refusing this application, particularly in view of the fact that the police, who are obviously well aware of those court proceedings, have not seen fit themselves to oppose this application for renewal. It relates to other premises in a very different area, and at which there was no sexual entertainment of any sort anyway. So, Chair, I think that really summarises the points which I have made in my written submissions, and they are all there for the committee members to read. So I don't think I need to detain you any longer.
Thank you very much. So what was on the breach of the second point on the breach of the rules around running a sex establishment? What was the nature of those breaches that happened upstairs?
Well, it said that the dancers were engaging in physical contact with their customers.
Okay, and were they?
Well, Mr. Melody doesn't know because he wasn't there, but certainly the licensing officers who attended, they masqueraded as customers, and they describe in some detail of their interaction with the dancers in that fashion. So it's not disputed, indeed it couldn't be disputed.
Okay. Ms. Shiramana, I think you had your hand up there for a while.
Oh, sorry, Chair. It's just to let the committees know that today's decision we have to make based on the opposition received from the interested parties for the renewal of the sex establishment. So whatever Mr. Forbes referring to are not quite relevant for this particular application. I just want to let the members know.
Okay. So the only representations on which we can have regard are those that are in the papers themselves. Right?
That's right, Chair.
Yes, I've sought to address all of those in what I've said to you, and they're also addressed in my written submissions.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, Chair, I didn't understand that exchange. Apologies.
I think what's been suggested is that the only objections that we can refer to are any those objections from residents. Is that correct?
That's right, Chair, because the purpose of this hearing is to consider the representation received for the renewal of the sex establishment. So the committees has to make decision based on those representations for this renewal. So whatever Mr. Forbes was referring to are not relevant as part of this application. That's why I just want to clarify.
Except insofar as they're contained in the representations that we have in front of us.
Well, Chair, I was seeking to deal with other matters which were set out in documents that were lodged for the previous committee meeting. But if you are not disposed to consider those anyway, then so be it. I'm sorry to have taken up your time replying to them.
Well, sorry, but we need a clarification here from the legal officer.
So basically, we have to consider the representations that have been made from local residents in respect of the application, not any sort of other representations that have come in.
But we also
So,
consider the evidence given by the applicant.
yes, that's correct. Yes, so that's
So
the
if the
evidence.
applicant has chosen to tell us that he's been in breach of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 conditions on his SEV license, then we can take cognizance of that.
Yes, yes, that's correct.
Okay, well, in which case I suggest that we do so. And indeed, a number of the matters that Mr. Forbes just spoke about are also listed in the representations that we have in Appendix E to the the document pack, including a conviction for contravening fire regulations. And there are a number of other matters in there as well, including I think a number of matters that Mr. Forbes, you haven't addressed, and I don't know if you wanted to address anything further in the representations from residents, or if I think your point was that those are matters that had been raised previously and there were repetitions of objections that had been made when the license was up for renewal before, and they were considered not sufficient to warrant the license not being granted or renewed.
Chair, it might be easiest if I simply read out the paragraph in my written submissions that I've referred to earlier in relation to that. Residents' objections largely repeat matters raised in relation to the renewal of the license by the subcommittee at its meeting on the 17th of May 2019, and which were not then considered sufficient grounds to refuse that application. These related to the character of the locality, the existence of similar venues in the area, although such is in accord with the council's policy adopted in 2011, the garden next door and a nearby nursery school and street litter. Now, I can go into that in more detail if the committee wishes me to do so, but it seemed to me that I could deal with that in that comprehensive way by saying that all of these matters are simply a repetition of what was said previously, and which the then committee did not consider carried sufficient weight.
And that includes the references to Mr. Melody pleading guilty to the fire safety regulation breaches in April 2019, and indeed sentencing judge saying that Mr. Melody treated public servants with a measure of disdain and possibly arrogance. That was raised in 2019 as well, was it?
Well, indeed, and that's why I addressed it in my opening remarks to you. Again, I can simply read what I said in the written submissions.
I don't think you need to do that. I was just trying to establish whether or not.
With all of that in what I've said, yes.
No, I was just trying to establish whether those parts of the representations were also repetition from what had been said in 2019.
No, they weren't repetition, they were new, and that's why I've addressed them directly.
I see. Okay. Did the Councillor Plivier or Councillor Root have any further questions for Mr. Forbes?
I have a bit, really, because correct me if I'm wrong, but what Mr. Forbes is saying is that people objected about the nature of the establishment in 2019 and littering and urinating and what have you nearby. And since the subcommittee decided nevertheless to grant the license, that he's not really addressing this set of issues. And I just don't really agree with that, because I think that these things are often a question of degree. So, it rather depends how many letters of complaint there are, how severe the littering, the urination, etc. is, as to whether or not we would want to take those things into consideration. The very fact that a previous subcommittee didn't withhold a license on those grounds doesn't mean that they're not relevant now. That's the point I'd like to make.
Well, can I respond to that, Chair? The letters, I have before me the letters from the meeting in 2019 and also the letters in relation to this application in 2020. I can see no difference between any of the matters that were raised in either substance or degree. The only new matter that I can see is the one that you've referred to relating to the prosecution for the breach of fire regulations in Bishop Stortford. Otherwise, they are identical.
But I mean, everything depends on context, right? So those the licensing subcommittee that heard the application in 2019 may have thought that may have given the applicant the benefit of the doubt. But I mean, you're coming to us and you're saying, well, actually, the applicant had guilty to breach of fire regulations. There had been, it appears that there had been a breach of the rules around how the sex establishment was to be run, and indeed there were breaches of the public health restrictions and rules during the pandemic. So, you know, in that context, this is part of a wider pattern of behaviour rather than isolated incidents. So I think, to my mind, it would be legitimate for this licensing subcommittee to look on those that behaviour that's reported to us by residents in a slightly different light. Or do you take issue with us doing so?
Chair, I think I do take issue with that. There are a number of matters which you are invited to consider, and you must look at each one on its own merits. Now, granted, once you have done that, you can then put the whole thing together and see what your overall impression is. I accept that as well. But in representing Mr. Malady, all I can do is respond to each of these individual items. The objections that were raised in 2019 about littering and so forth, it largely relates to people smoking outside the premises and not clearing up their cigarette butts.
And fighting and urination.
Did I see that?
Please, can I?
Yes, sorry, Councillor Clevier, please.
Sorry, but there are some other matters here. So I want to ask Mr. Melody whether he's ever advertised on a board live nude girls, which in the context of subsequent breaches, and it's a serious matter because of the requirements under his conditions. There's also the matter of somebody else complaining about touts outside soliciting inappropriate behaviour. That is also a serious complaint, which you've chosen just to ignore. I mean, just to ignore as some rubbish outside the premises. These are two highly critical comments which have been made, which are serious in the context of the renewal of this particular licence. And the other thing that is serious is the concerns about fights outside the premises. Now, these three are key, very important challenges from local residents, which in the context of the visits by our officers, really, you've just chosen to completely ignore them and pretend apparently that they're not there. So first of all, I would like to hear from Mr. Melody whether he has advertised live nude girls in contravention of his conditions. Then I would like to ask him to explain how it came that dancers employed in his establishment breached conditions 31 to 36 so flagrantly when our officers visited. How that could have come about, given that it's his responsibility to make sure that all his staff in a SEV understand clearly what is laid out. And it's always been our policy to make that very clear, to impress upon the licence holders how important and how vital we consider maintenance of those conditions are to the continuation of the licence.
Yes, you want to respond?
So I will deal with the first matter about advertising.
Yes.
I've never advertised. I've been there since 1986, and I've never advertised live nude girls.
So you completely deny that there's ever been a board saying live nude girls?
Never.
Girls.
Never.
Okay.
Okay, I think there were other matters as well that Councillor Clevier
Okay, the next matter is about fighting outside.
Yeah, and I think this is a reference, there's certainly a reference in Appendix E6 to a local resident saying that over a 15 period they've observed 1 to 2 fights per week outside the front door pub on the pavement between customers and door staff. Oftentimes I have been woken up by guttural screaming and threats and looked out and observed the familiar sight of a cluster of people mid-fracas. Usually there are customers being ejected. Sometimes it's the customers fighting each other, screaming, shouting at the top of their voices, high levels of noise. Police are regularly called in to address the situation. It's an oppressive and threatening situation to bear for residents and passers-by. Then it goes on to make reference to public urination, hassling taxi drivers, cigarette butts, litter, and a number of other matters. That doesn't sound like an establishment that we should be giving this council's licensing authorities endorsement to, does it?
Well, all I can say is 1 or 2 fights a week outside the front door. I haven't had 1 or 2 fights since 1986. In 35 years, I haven't had 1 or 2 fights there, let alone 1 or 2 fights a week between customers and door staff.
Mr. Melody, I've just showed him the letter of objection.
I haven't seen this letter before. This is I'm surprised the police haven't made representations if this was...
Well, if you can address the chair.
Again, these fights just don't happen. I'm sure if they did happen, that the police would have something to say about it. Screaming and shouting at the top of their voices, it just doesn't happen.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Clevier, did you have anything further on that?
Can I just add, Chair?
No, yes, I do. No, I want the rest of it. I want Mr. Melody, please, to address the other issues. There was also the touts outside the building, and then there was the very important issue of how he came to have in his employ presumably young women who were unaware of the very important conditions attached to his license.
Okay, so there is a taxi rank immediately outside the front door of these premises. I don't actually have any control over the taxi drivers. As regards the girls that work there...
Sorry, forgive me, but are you suggesting that the taxi drivers were touting passers-by to go in and receive inappropriate behaviour?
No,
Is that what you're suggesting?
No, the taxi drivers certainly don't do any touting.
So you're simply denying that there's ever been any touting of your business outside in the street?
Certainly not.
Fine, just deny it. But I'm embarrassed that you haven't seen these. I'm embarrassed on behalf of your solicitor that you can stand here and say you haven't seen these objections. But anyway, that's fine. Okay, then I want to know about how it came. How your explanation is, and how you seriously, how on earth could that happen? That there are young women employed there who weren't aware of the limitations, because the context of this is it makes that almost inconceivable. But anyway, I'd like to hear your explanation, please.
Well, I have apologised for my staff's behaviour, and I accept what the council enforcement officers, what they've said in their report. I've closed the first floor dance area, and any entertainment now takes place on the ground floor, where it will be more closely monitored.
But Mr. Melody, forgive me, but I didn't ask you that. I mean, that's like Boris saying I didn't know my staff were having parties. You are responsible for what your staff do. You haven't explained to us how several of your staff came to behave in this manner, even though it's an absolutely key part of your license that they do not do so.
I accept that.
Do you give them any instructions?
I'm sorry?
Do you give them any instructions?
Maybe I did neglect to give them instructions, but as far as I know, they were instructed not to get too close to the customers. And as I say, I accept what the council enforcement officer has said. And all I can do is apologise and make sure it won't happen again.
Well, I submit that that's pretty weak in the circumstances.
What sort of oversight do you have over what goes on in your premises then? Because I mean, you're the license holder here, right?
What was the question?
What oversight do you have as to what goes on in your premises? Can you please explain, for instance, how often you are there?
I go in most mornings. I'm not there very often at night. I go in most mornings, and there's a book, an incident book, and there's anything written in the incident book, which there never is, I will deal with if there ever was. And I just leave it to my staff. The business sort of runs itself.
How do you make it clear to the people working on the premises what the restrictions are on their behaviour as set out in the licence?
I have showed them the Hackney Council conditions of the licence.
I mean, presumably that's quite a dense, well, that is quite a dense document. Do you point out particular restrictions? Do you produce any guide to that licence?
Well, I have stressed them that there shouldn't be any physical contact between themselves and customers.
Can I ask how many of your female dance employees are now have English as a second language?
Maybe 50%.
So 50% of them may be inadequately prepared to keep your license conditions.
What, because they have English as a second language?
Well, they may not be able to read the conditions and understand them when you hand them to them.
No, they can all read English quite well.
And are there any other restrictions on their behaviour that are contained in the licence that you set out for them?
Do I personally impose any other restrictions?
No. Do you personally, or does anyone in your employ point out particular restrictions on the behaviour as set out in the licence? There's the physical contact, no physical contact condition that you just mentioned. Are there any others that you point out?
I have stressed them that they must keep a 1 metre distance between themselves and customers.
Anything relating to their attire?
No. These are self-employed dancers. Did you say their attire?
Mm-hmm.
No.
Okay. Councillor Root, I think you wanted to come in.
I just wondered how often Mr. Melody is actually on the premises, because it seems to me that what you just said to us was that, you know, the place kind of more or less runs itself. I assume you have some sort of duty manager who's in charge there, and surely it's the duty manager's job to make sure that the girls all know about all this stuff, and the duty manager would be the person who would be seeing when they're not abiding by it. So I wonder what kind of contact you have with your duty manager, how often you're in there, how often you check up on whether your manager is actually doing his job, because, you know, clearly the place isn't running itself.
Well, I have one girl that's worked for me for 20 years, another girl's worked for me for 15 years. And I believe they're quite proficient in operating the premises. For the last 5 or 6 years, it hasn't been that busy anyway, and it is fairly simple to run.
But it was those managers who were overseeing behaviour on the premises when these incidents happened and the council enforcement officers visited the premises, right?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
So the managers that you just referred to,
yes,
they were managing the premises.
One of them was there on the night in particular, yes.
Okay. And did you ask her how this happened?
I did, yes.
And what did she say?
She didn't really give me a proper explanation, but she just admitted that she was negligent in allowing it to happen. And that is why I've shut the first floor.
And are both of those managers still the main managers for you at the moment?
One of them is, yeah.
Okay. And what are the processes that you have put in place to prevent this from happening again, apart from closing the... Is it just closing the floor upstairs?
I've just asked all my staff to be more stringent in enforcing the rules on the sexual entertainment venues.
Okay, Councillor Pluvier.
One of the aspects about the COVID regulations that did concern me at the time we were looking at that was the danger to the young women. And I just wanted to ask you about the what the facilities are for the young women in your premises in terms of privacy and dressing and all that stuff, especially now you've moved it downstairs, moved the activities downstairs.
They've got 2 different changing rooms.
Is that all?
Yeah, that's all.
So what about washing facilities?
Yeah, they've got washing facilities there. There's a shower room.
Okay, it's a shame I have to prompt you for all this. That's fine.
How were the performers paid, Mr. Melody?
Well, they're self-employed. They're paid by the fees they get off from the customers who they perform for.
Okay, and so what happens while the dancing they ask for money? Is that?
I'm sorry.
While they're performing, do they ask for money?
I think before they perform.
Okay. Are there any restrictions on what they can do while they're performing?
Yes, there are restrictions. It's just nude dancing, and they shouldn't be doing anything other than nude dancing.
Okay. Councillor Pluvier, Councillor Root, are there further questions or matters on which we want clarity? No? Okay. Well, sorry. No. In which case, Mr. Forbes or Mr. Melody, do you want to say anything further before we adjourn? I think what we'll actually do is move to the next application and then adjourn and consider this matter. Ms. North?
Just double checking that everyone has spoken who needs to speak. We can just check.
So I don't think we had anyone else here for this
just
matter.
double checking, that's all, just worrying in case we missed anyone. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Forbes, Mr. Melody, is there anything that you wanted to say before we move on from this item?
Nothing further, except simply to inquire, will there be a decision tonight or on a later occasion?
So
they can the licensing service can notify them tomorrow morning of the decision.
All I'm really getting at is that there's no need for us to wait whilst you hear this application for the other premises.
No.
Thank you very much. In that event, there's nothing further to be said.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for coming along this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you, Chair, and I'm leaving too. Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we will just wait for Councillor Fajana Thomas to join.
I wonder if we might just take a very short comfort break. Would that be all right, Chair?
Yep. Shall we come back in at 10 to?
Thank you.
So that's 10-2. I think we can start again. We have Councillor Root, and indeed we've also been joined by Councillor Fajana Thomas. So that will be the licensing subcommittee for this item, which is off Broadway, 6365 Broadway Market. If everyone is here, and Mr. Selby, have your other residents and people who sent in representations join the meeting?
They're here under the name Rooney Thompson, who hopefully you can see the list.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I'll be led by the licensing officer as to what we need to do about the residents, the people who've made, the other persons who've made representations, whether we need to know who each of them is and that sort of thing. But Ms. North, you might have a solution to this.
I just wanted to know whether or not the list has been sent through either to the licensing officer or to Peter Gray, so that at least we know we can to help us to identify that they have made a representation. That's all.
I forwarded the list to my barrister, who and I can forward it to you directly if that helps.
We do need the list so that we can monitor to make sure that no one's speaking who hasn't made a representation. Thank you.
Mr. Hughes, can you shed some light?
I'm afraid I can't, Chairman. The list I've got is the committee papers, and everything's redacted on my committee papers. So I'm afraid there must be an original set, presumably somewhere with the names not redacted on it.
No, Mr. Hughes, your client's just said that he emailed you the list of persons who will be on the call.
I haven't had that list.
I think we have a list in the chat.
Super, have you got the list from?
So I think we have a list in the chat.
In the chat, I provided a list.
Oh, I'm sorry, chat. Okay.
I can guarantee that Louis, Shori, Felipe, I can't pronounce his surname, Mika, Marcus, and Silviu, and definitely sent in representations. And my father, Stephen Selby, is also a licensee and the nearest neighbour living upstairs with me.
Okay.
Has he made a representation?
He's the licensee. I don't think he needs to do that.
Sorry.
Ms. Braywood, is it something you wanted to raise?
Yeah, I just wondered if we could be clear that making complaints that have been provided in the papers are not confused with representation, and the actual representation was made to the license review following the public notice. It's just that several residents who have made complaints believe also that they submitted representation, were invited to this meeting and have since been redacted on the grounds that it was a complaint, not a representation. So there would have been a large number of residents here that who are the main reason why probably this has all come about, who directly live next to and by Broadway Market. So I'm concerned that if we could please clear that up to be sure that these are people that have made a proper representation that actually fit in with the licensing objectives. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much.
I'm sorry, otherwise it's unfair now. The balance will be unfair and the representation will be unfair.
Okay, so hold on. Are you saying that there are a number of residents who made representations to object, well, or rather in support of this review, so to object to the way in which the premises were being run, and those residents have, for some reason, not had their representations included in this pack?
Yeah, well, in fact, I was the only one originally that received it, and some residents then inquired as to why they hadn't. Some were then invited and then had it redacted because they said it was a complaint. and not, it was recorded as a complaint and not down as to the review of the licensed premises. So there's some confusion because many of them feel they had, because they had been asking for this.
So I wonder whether the licensing officer can shed any light on what's happened here.
Sorry, Chair. I can confirm, like, in support of the review, we received 4 representations. The other representation where CFO was referring to, it was not referring in particular to the review application. It was a general complaint. So those was not considered as part of this application.
So that was why I asked for clarification of the members that representation that Mr. Selby has brought in, that these actually clearly define the same as, and actually clearly you have proof that they have actually written in with a formal representation.
So actually connected with this application rather than this review application, rather than just in general terms, we like off-Broadway and what off-Broadway does, right?
Yeah.
So because we received around 200 of them, so we have filtered it, and we are able to see few of the names on the list where they have wrote to us in against the review, but we couldn't find all the names, only some of the names we have.
No, but I think that, sorry, Councillor, I'll bring, and Councillor Fajana Thomas, I'll bring you in a second. But I think the point being made is that there were a number of complaints made about the premises that were sent in, presumably triggered by this review, and that they haven't been included in this pack. So at the moment we've got 80 odd, so 4 in support of the review, so complaints about the premises, and 80 odd that are supportive of the way in which the premises are being run. But we should have included all those others that all those other complaints about the way in which the premises are run.
If you look through the papers from the residents' complaints that have been included from the council and the police, you will actually see that many of them have actually asked for a review or were pleased that the review has come through. They refer to that. So it's disturbing that we're not going to get a fair representation here of the actual scale of the impact on local people.
Ms. Braywood, can I just bring in Councillor Root and then Councillor Fajana Thomas? I think they want to come in on this.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted some clarification from the licensing officer, because as I'm just scanning through, looking at some of the comments which are writing in support of the establishment, they don't necessarily reference the events which are happening here this evening, this review at all. They just are very boldly in support of the establishment. A little bit, as Ms. Brewwood is describing, that other people have written in very general terms against the establishment, not necessarily referencing the review. So I do wonder why we've included some of these, and I'm just picking one at random pretty much here. Appendix C24 is a 2-liner, which doesn't make any reference to this hearing this evening or look to me in any way like a formal representation. So I'm just wondering, why is it that...
Sorry, the process, councillors, according to the Licensing Act 2003, any comments received in reference to that particular application within those 28 days of consultation period, we accept only those representation and we attach as part of the report. So all the ones which you're referring to was received within those 28 days of consultation period, and it was received in particularly referring to the particular application. So based on that, that's how we enclose all these objections or representations within the report.
So I think we may have lost Councillor Root, but just for Councillor Fajana Thomas, I'll come to you in a second, and you as well, Mr. Hughes, and James Tompkins if you need to. So what you're saying that the representations that are included in this pack will want, so it's a question of timing rather than what the representation says. So all the complaints or the representations that Ms. Brewwood, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, is all those representations that Ms. Brewwood is referring to came outside of that period. Is that what you're saying?
That's right, Chair. So any representations in support or against of the reviews which was received within those 28 days of consultation period based on the application, those are the ones which we include within the pack as per the legislation requirement.
Okay, Councillor Fitzgerald-Thomas.
Thank Chair. That last statement has cleared my question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Hughes, I think you wanted to say something on this, and I'm sorry, we will come to you to speak about the review itself, but if you've got anything on this point, then please do come in now.
Well, thank you, Chair. Yes, just to confirm what was just said, really, that there's a very clearly laid down procedure under the regulations, as you'll know, when a notice goes up at the premises and it's advertised on the council's website and news gets around. And that allows 28 days for people to put in reps, positive or negative, about an application. So the law is quite strict on that. If there are a whole batch of other representations which are outside of the time, I'm sure the same applies to us, because there are, I think, about 100 or so representations which we've not seen on our side, which may have come in after the date. I don't know, but all of ours came in during the date. And I think insofar as the generality of some of them is concerned, it's quite right to say some of them are general, as are some of those in favour of the review. But I think most of them, having looked through them as I've been working on this case, are dealing with the 4 licensing objectives, particularly one of the licensing objectives, which is nuisance, which is at the heart of this one.
So thank you very much for that, Ms. Braywood. I'd suggest that we move on from this, because I think this has solved or resolved this uncertainty as to what's happened here. But what you can certainly do is tell us about any other residents that you may or may not be representing here when we come to you addressing the subcommittee, and then we can consider what's appropriate in terms of taking that into account. But certainly you've given a very thorough report on the reasons why you tell us that the review should lead to a revocation of the license. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Plenty of pictures. So
just
yes.
I didn't want to interrupt earlier, but actually pronunciation is Brewood.
Brewood, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm sorry for mispronouncing.
No, it's fine. It happens all the time.
So I think we will start with the licensing officer, to tell us about this application.
Thank you, Chair. Licensing service on receipt of an application from the licensing authority for the review of the premises license under Section 51 of the Licensing Act 2003 for the off-Broadway 62 to 65 Broadway market on the grounds of the prevention of the public nuisance as stated within the report. We have received representation from the police, other persons in support of the review and against the review. The premises license holder has submitted additional information which has been circulated. I have nothing much to add. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. In which case, I think it's the licensing authority that has brought this review.
Yes, it is indeed. Yes, it is indeed, Chair. My name's Robert Gardner. I'm the Enforcement and Business Regulation Manager for Hackney, and I bring this matter before the committee tonight. The committee will, I trust, have read the report, so I don't intend to go over the detail that's held, the large amount of detail that's held within it. But I would like to point out that we believe this clearly demonstrates from local residents that complaints have been significant, and there has been a significant amount of public nuisance generated from the activities of the premises and in its immediate surroundings. That is to say that most of the complaints actually name Off-Broadway as the perpetrator of this particular nuisance. Most of these were actually had been generated in 2021 over the summer. Apart from in that period in April 21, when there was a complaint about drinking competitions within the premises, the majority of the cases of complaints concern noise and disturbance from the external and immediate areas. At one point, the garden was being used, and there were significant complaints about that. But I understand that currently, and that the licensee has eventually decided not to use this particular area for for that particular usage, after there were warnings, it has to be said, from the local authority and the police. We met with the licensee and Mr. Selby, his representatives, in October last year, where we discussed the situation. Complaints had by that time, slightly reduced. But at this meeting, we explained that what we wished for, without anything further, was to actually for these complaints to be reduced, and for the licensee to take action to take steps to significantly reduce the nuisance. Mr. Selby appeared to agree to this, and we spoke for some measures that could be agreed to perhaps mitigate and remove the nuisances, but there was no further discussion on this. We also spoke at the time that it would be useful if there was an attempt at mediation between the business and some of the residents and complainants, but it seems that this was eventually difficult to arrange, and despite efforts, didn't actually occur. We now believe that, due in part to the reduction of complaints and a return to more normal trading conditions, that measures could be put in place via conditions to be imposed on the license, which would reduce and remove any potential nuisance going forward. We haven't discussed these with the licensee, but I think they may well come to speak about them anyway in going forward with this matter. But effectively, they would principally concern reducing the external consumption of alcohol on the premises. They could, for example, prevent the sale of drinks in open containers for consumption outside the premises. Certainly, conditions should be placed in respect of the garden, in that it cannot be used for customers to consume alcohol or other drinks at any time. On the external street area, that is actually out Delicott Street and Broadway Market, it might be agreed that conditions could be imposed which allowed only seated customers to consume alcohol provided by the premises, and that such consumption should terminate at 9 p.m, and that the seats rendered so that they cannot then be used by customers or others. These would be seats, as agreed by the authority in any event, and would be only adjacent to the premises. The condition in respect of smoking does need addressing. It talks about 4 smokers outside the area, but it doesn't say exactly where the area is, and I think that could something that the licensee could address this evening. And I do believe that there should be perhaps conditions imposed upon those smokers that they cannot themselves consume drinks whilst they are smoking outside the premises. To ensure that these conditions are observed, staff or SIO staff should be employed. At the moment, it says they should be. The license talks about being considered to be employed, but I think they should definitely be employed certainly for Friday and Saturday nights, to ensure that the conditions that we're discussing there should be imposed, should be sort of controlled. There may be others for the committee, and obviously there will be other perhaps representations from the business. I would say that we would actually ask the committee to ask Mr. Selby to really read his license very carefully and to abide by what is contained there. I've had a recent notification from a resident who pointed out that there was an advert for the basement area, which advertises for 50 individuals to attend, but in fact that licensed area is strictly reduced to 40. There have been some measures agreed by the police. We weren't party to these, and nor have they been aired with us in any way. But I'd obviously invite the committee to take those into consideration as well. That ends my current representation, and open for questions in the normal course of the event.
So, I mean, this makes things slightly difficult, doesn't it, if you've not shared your proposed license conditions, additional license conditions with the licensee? Are you proposing that we draft those license conditions during this meeting?
That is a possibility, yes.
Okay. That's given the number of conditions there that you're proposing, that would make things relatively difficult. The alternative would be that this subcommittee gives a view as to what it's minded to do between the alternatives of revocation and not revocation, And then in those circumstances, the licensing authority, we adjourn the hearing, and then the licensing authority goes and speaks to the licensee. I mean, an alternative is
all possibilities are surely open to the committee at this stage to be able to impose, as from revocation right through to imposing conditions, or to do indeed nothing.
Absolutely, but I think I think would have been easier if the licensing authority had spoken to the applicant, the licensee. Councillor Root.
I'm just wanting to be clear, really. So what I'm understanding at the moment then is that both the licensing authority and the police, so long as the licensee is happy with the conditions that are being proposed and no longer proposing revocation, is that right?
I think, on balance, looking at the situation, what we want is primarily for the residents not to have any cause for complaint as a result of the activities of this particular premises. Which is to say, and looking at the quantum of complaints, it seems to be that most of those concern external noise that is generated immediately outside the premises. And if you look at the complaints that have come through, where they specifically name the premises as the cause of the noise, and that therefore we would seek to reduce and mitigate and, well, eliminate any cause for complaint. And if that is the possibility that could be forwarded, then the business can continue to trade safely and quietly, and whilst the residents can enjoy their the quietness of their own homes, if you like.
And is there any particular reason why this hasn't been discussed with the licensee in advance? Because is it just you've run out of time, or what?
I don't think we came to any conclusion. I think we were always we were waiting for a move for them. They were waiting for a move from us. Who knows? I mean, it was one of those things. I certainly wasn't aware of the negotiations with the police. They didn't inform us. No, I appreciate that. Maybe the licensee was responsible for that.
There have been no negotiations with the police, Chairman.
Well, so can we come to that in a second? Sorry. Councillor Fajana Thomas, you've got your hand up. Have you got something to ask the licensing authority?
Thanks, Chair. It's just following on this and your suggestion in terms of moving things forward. If we are considering, or if the licensing authority representative put forward these conditions, that if that can happen, again, there is a conversation that's been another conversation or negotiation with the police, and probably I'm guessing maybe the police got a few conditions of their own. So it would be, I'm just thinking how we're going to combine both conditions or both terms of negotiations in terms of tonight's hearing.
So I think what I suggest is that we run through the hearing today. We hear from the police and then the applicant and then other persons. And then we take a view as to how we're going to address this. And I think at that point we'll have a better view as to, I mean, if we decide that there isn't sufficient evidence to revoke the license, then I think this question all goes away. If we think that there is sufficient evidence to revoke the license, or we're uncertain and we have serious concerns about the way in which the premises is being run, and in those circumstances, I think we might need to resolve this issue about whether or not our concerns can be addressed by additional license conditions being added. So in those circumstances, what I suggest we do now is that PC Ryan speaks to us for up to 5 minutes about the police's views on this review application, and then we hear from Mr. And then we hear from the applicant, from Mr. Hughes, and then move on to other persons. So, Councillor Fajana Thomas, Councillor Rout, if you disagree with that approach, then do shout now.
No, I agree with the approach, Chair.
That sounds reasonable. I can just see that Mr. Tompkins has got his hand up. I don't know if it's a clarification or something.
Yeah.
You will get a chance to speak later on, won't you?
Yeah, so Mr. Tompkins, we will come to you after hearing from the Metropolitan Police Service and from the licensee. Is there something burning that you need to raise now?
Well, I simply wanted to make the point that the complaints have abated mostly because we were waiting for this review, which is then postponed and rescheduled. But I can speak further about that.
Okay, thank you. So, PC Ryan.
Thank you, Chair. I think I can provide some clarity around these conditions. In relation to this review, there has been no dialogue with the venue at all, or the licensees. I think the conditions that are being referred to are I think is this the 3-point plan that Mr. Hughes refers to in his email. I think there's just a typo on that. It should be 2020 because it was during COVID, not 2021. So I think that's why everybody thinks that they have very recently been agreed, but that's not the case. So you've seen my representations, and I run through my evidence chronologically, and it shows a consistent breaches in relation to the COVID legislation and the social distancing, and the constant crowds that have been drinking outside in the streets. Further to these dates, and since I have submitted my representations, excuse me, I wanted to add that I visited Broadway Market in September 24th on a Friday, and we were on a proactive operation tackling violence and antisocial behaviour. Now, Broadway Market, excuse me, was quite busy. All the restaurants were open. All the restaurants had people outside having their meals, having a drink, but all those customers were sat at a table. They were all eating in the curtilage of the building. Off Broadway was the only premises on this occasion to have at least 50 people, I think we counted, outside, all strewn across the streets. And they were completely blocking the road, making it difficult for other members of the public to pass. And no attempt was being made by the management or the door supervisors to control them or bring them back towards the building. The visits listed in my representations are not exhaustive. We've been, these occasions are the ones that I've listed because they've been recorded, but during lockdowns, during all the different tiers and the stages that we had of the changing COVID legislation, we visited at least weekly, once a week, I'll say. So we found it increasingly frustrating that we've needed to address the same issues over and over again, and that has been the drinking in the streets and the crowds outside, and no effort being made to rectify the issues. We feel that we've exhausted all of our options, and we had also felt that we'd reached the point where we would apply to review the premises licence. There's been consistent non-compliance despite several warnings and visits from police, and a complete refusal from Mr. Selby to engage with us. In fact, at the last attempt to open dialogue, he was rude and argumentative to us on the phone, and he's shown a complete disregard for the promotion of the licensing objectives. Perhaps a variation of conditions could be agreed, however, but the question would be whether the operator would be able to operate within the confines of these conditions. I've discussed with residents about would it help for no drinking outside after 9 o'clock, the removal of off sales, the on sales maybe to be reduced by 30 minutes because at the moment the on sales match the closing time, which would again make it difficult for dispersal and close at the end of the night. And I'd also just like to clarify who the DPS is at this time. I'm not sure if that's been varied recently or whether it's still Mr. Byron Knight, because we've had no dialogue there either. And I know that he's moved away from the premises and doesn't have anything to do with it anymore. I think unless anybody's got any points for clarification or any questions.
So, as the chair, I'll take my prerogative and ask the question first. If there isn't a DPS, then what are the implications of that? Is that a breach of?
No DPS, it would mean that all sales of alcohol have been unlawful.
Okay.
They won't be able to operate without the DPS. They'd have to obtain a new DPS, so that they wouldn't be selling any alcohol until a DPS is appointed.
Okay, thank you very much. And how many? So you say that you visited the area weekly, and then every week there have been these breaches that you've seen. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, so that runs to dozens, presumably.
Yeah, especially during the pandemic, when we were visiting very regularly, because unfortunately Broadway Market became a hotspot, and it was being shown on television quite a lot as a place that people were gathering in their hundreds, and there was a lot of overcrowding. So, and obviously the legislation was changing often, sometimes daily, weekly, and so we would be doing our patrols, making sure that everybody knew what the legislation was at that time. And we did that to make sure that everybody was very clear on what the rules were. But like I said, we would find them breaching every time we went. They've received warning letters from us. We've had meetings with them, telephone conversations with them. But like I said, we've seen no improvement.
And certainly in 2020, but I think also in 2021, there was an injunction to prevent drinking in London Fields, right?
Yes, there was. And
presumably, Mr. Selby was aware of that, and all the licensees, all the managers of licensed premises on.
Yes, it was very well publicised.
Yeah. So, I mean, that sounds. If premises is selling lots of alcohol in open containers for people to wander around in that area, in the knowledge that there are these very, very severe antisocial behaviour issues in the area that had caused the council to actually apply to the court for restriction of alcohol consumption in the area, that strikes me as somewhat irresponsible.
I agree.
Councillor Roux, Councillor Fajana Thomas, sorry, do you have any questions for PCUI?
Not at this stage, no.
Okay. Mr. Hughes, you've had your hand up for a while, so I'm very sorry for not coming to you earlier, but in any case, this is an opportunity for you to address us for up to, say, 10 minutes on this application for a review of the premises license.
Oh, I'm sorry. So I had my hand up precisely because of this reason and another one. Miss Ryan, we know very well, of course, over the years, has raised an issue regarding a matter on the 24th of September. I've had no advance notice of that at all, Chairman, I'm afraid. It's not contained in the papers, and nothing has been sent through to me that this would be part of Ms. Ryan's case tonight. So we're taking somewhat surprise on that one. But in terms of the running order, I assume that as you correctly said at the beginning, Chairman, it's for the person who's seeking the review to put their case first, and those who are in support of the review. So I was waiting to hear from what the others had to say before I answer. And I think in terms of the time, I will certainly need longer than 5 minutes to address all the issues that are presented for us to deal with. So
okay, well,
it's been about 10 to 15 minutes, but no longer than that.
Okay, so shall we listen to the? Shall we hear from the other persons, including Ms. I think we had Ms. Broke. I'm sorry. Mr. Tompkins, you were E3, is that right?
Thank you. Yes.
So if you could just speak to us and talk to us about anything in your representation that you wanted to draw out. Clearly, we've read it, but I think given the number of people here, if you could restrict what you say to 2 minutes, if possible.
Okay, I'll do my very best. Yeah. Okay. So I would like to argue for the revocation of the premises license, because I don't think any conditions set at this point will be adhered to, because I think it's plainly obvious that Mr. Selby has not been able to adhere to his current license conditions, and he's shown consistent disregard for both council and police involvement. And I think that's very clear from the statement submitted. Personally, I've lived here for 4 years, since 2018. And it's been a persistent problem. I've submitted over 50 noise complaints, constant involvement late at night, with big crowds outside my flat. I can't sleep. Obviously, I know some of the representations in favour of off-Broadway have said that you shouldn't live on Broadway Market if you don't like noise. And obviously, I love Broadway Market. I knew it was going to be noisy, but I didn't expect huge crowds, both at the front and back of my property, drinking late into the night, and the establishment being open beyond its licensed hours. I don't think that's reasonable for anyone to accept. I would also say the things that have troubled me are persistently open after licensed hours, large crowds, late into the night. There's public urination. There's been disorderly behaviour. I've had to phone the police several times about this. There's persistently noise from live music, which is heard into my bedroom. And then it all culminated in the opening of a beer garden in the rear, which is just behind my bedroom. We weren't notified about this. I spoke to Mr. Selby. I went down myself as soon as I saw what they were doing construction-wise, and he refused to engage with me persistently on this point. The beer garden opened, and there were huge crowds during COVID. COVID rules were broken, as we saw, but it was very, very loud, and it really made my flat unlivable. There were crowds surrounding from all sides, and he refused to engage persistently, saying that he's lived, or his family have lived here since the 1970s, and that I'm a newcomer and that I have no say. And then on top of that, I saw on social media that we've been kind of vilified. I'm speaking on behalf of multiple neighbours. We've been called NIMBYs, and that we're going to be taken revenge on, and we somehow kind of like to raise our concerns. You know, I love Broadway Market. I want flourishing businesses. All the other businesses around here are very respectful. I have no problems with any of them. They engage with me. You know, there's Cat and Mutton across the road. No crowds there. We take it. You know, I love it. It's simply just persistent breach of it off Broadway, and there's this persistent refusal to engage in any conversation with any of the neighbours. I just feel that any new conditions are not going to be adhered to. I have no confidence in that. It was particularly bad during the pandemic, I'll accept that, but we have stopped complaining the last few weeks and months because we've been waiting for this review, which has been rescheduled. I don't think it's fair to take the frequency of complaints into account, because if I'd known that was going to happen, I would have continued to report, you know, but there's only so much time I have to keep reporting. I can't do that every day. And I'd like to make the point also that both NHS workers living in this flat, I was working night shifts, and there was literally like 40 people drinking alcohol outside my window. I raised that with Mr. Selby, and he would not listen to me, and it really had a really detrimental impact on my mental health. So I simply, I'm sorry to say, I cannot trust that any license conditions will be adhered to.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we've had Mr. Grocock as well. Ryan, are you there?
Hi there. Sorry, yep, I'm here. Good evening, everyone.
So again, if you could limit yourself to 2 minutes, we have ready representation as well.
Perfect, thank you. So I'm also a neighbour of Off-Broadway. Had very similar issues, so very large crowds just around Off-Broadway, not any other bars on the whole of Broadway Market, because as you know, there are a lot of licensed premises. So I'd say in excess of 100 people drinking outside of the front with clearly labelled containers from Off-Broadway on a regular basis after their opening hours, so way after 12 midnight and up to 1 a.m. They then decided to open a beer garden, which was explicitly against their planning permission. So they built a new premises without planning permission and also opened a beer garden, which is explicitly forbidden in their original planning permission. This was then, obviously, we tried to engage with them. They refused to close that down. Even when they had a cessation notice from the council, they continued to operate that beer garden after that date, causing significant noise and disruption to our daily lives as residents. As a previous resident said, All the other premises on Broadway Market are very engaging. We have Cat and Mutton right opposite, and they're always very respectful. They take their seats in at a reasonable time and no issues there at all. Anytime we've been approached Mr. Selby, he's very dismissive, non-engaging. His attitude is that he was here first. Broadway Market is a loud place, and that's that. There's no negotiation at all. I believe that he does have a deep-seated attitudinal problem that unfortunately can't be resolved, and he's not fit to hold a license. We've had multiple instances of the council having things ignored and rules not followed, multiple visits by the police where he's been rude and non-conforming with their rules, and also multiple residents that have approached him. And again, the same thing happens. He's completely dismissive and refuses to engage. And unfortunately, it's come to that point where how can we trust that if any conditions are put on, they will be followed? And it's sad because I used to like Off-Broadway. It's a nice place. I'm not disputing that. And I think that's why we can't take the character references that we've seen, because no one's disputing that it's not a nice bar and you can't have a good time there. That's absolutely fine. But obviously, that needs to be within the confines of the licensing conditions, which we've consistently seen over a number of years, despite enforcement efforts, have been breached. And that's the detriment of the Hackney residents, as you can see from the many complaints that have been put in. So I think I've definitely contacted noise enforcement probably 20 to 30 times, and that's been verified by various visits. And again, even in the last few months, they continue to use that outdoor area at the front way after 10 o'clock, which is our current pavement license. So definitely up to midnight, groups of people still drinking at the front there. So I've got no faith that any conditions that you put on the premises will be followed, unfortunately. It's a sad state to be in, but I think there's only so many chances you can give someone. And after 2 years of constant rule breaking, obviously there needs to be some harsh enforcement action, unfortunately. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Ms. Brewer, I've mispronounced your name again, I'm very sorry. Louise, are you there?
It's muted.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Committed the cardinal sin and forgot to unmute. Firstly, I'd like to let everybody know that I'm a direct resident that lives probably 50 yards or so away from Broadway, from off Broadway. Secondly, I'd also like to point out that I've lived here well over 20 years. And thirdly, I'd like to point out that many of the complainants that you have sight of in front of you have all been here. In fact, the majority of them have all been here 10 years plus, some longer than me. So we're not newbies or anything like that. And you should have a right, regardless, when you move into a premises, not to expect excessive noise and have the right of a quality of life, and that the licensing objectives are met. So that first said, I also am here as representing the Safer Neighbourhood panel. And that, as for those that don't know, that comprises of a large, the whole of the London Fields ward that can bring concerns, raise it around crime, antisocial behaviour, etc., which we then engage with the police and local authority. Regarding Broadway Market, regarding off-Broadway, this has resulted in, I think, probably for the best part of 10 years, regular complaints coming in little batches, especially over the summer months, that regularly aren't addressed. When residents try to address them, they're not addressed by, they're not met or engaged and deal with until it comes a point of that, action is going to be taken by the local authority or the police. And then it quietens down and then it comes up. So when we had the main issues that began to arise 2 years ago, I have just constantly, week in, week out, been inundated with phone calls of distress, anxiety, confusion. Who do we complain to? Where do we go? What do we do? It has been horrendous. I have witnessed a huge amount. I'd like to, rather than go over everything, as you will see from the papers I've submitted, I've given you a reasonable detail of what has gone on, complete with photographs. That is almost all of what I witnessed myself. There is a file that is probably 20 times of photographic evidence bigger than that. I would like to say that I myself have standing in the coffee queue next to Off Broadway, happening to look at bad behaviour where pints of lager were being rushed out the window, and just happened to be looking back, was made to feel uncomfortable and intimidated by the manager at the time, who wanted to know what I was doing. Why are you staring at us? You know, what's it to do with you? You know, this is none of your business. Why are you causing trouble? To which I ignored. And I am aware that many other residents have witnessed and experienced exactly the same issue. It's not the first time it's happened to me. I have members of the public that regularly drink in there who actually say things to me. I know that other residents are having the same issues. Now, that aside, which is a personal thing and local residents thing, I personally do not believe, and so, as do the many people that I'm representing here that are residents that are local, that they are meeting not just the prevention of public nuisance requirement, but all of the licensing objectives. Because throughout the pandemic, and I know that the argument will be that the pandemic is coming to a close and it's not in the same, I would argue that this was the one time when you should have actually been ensuring that you were meeting those, especially for the public safety and interest. You should not have been ignoring those. But the urination, defecation, again, all of those things, the antisocial behaviour, the drug dealing, the taxis, the taxi drivers that park where I am, which is at the very end of the road from Off Broadway. I'm not directly close. Excuse me, I'm just going to run out of power. Thank you. My apologies, sorry. You know, taxi drivers emptying rubbish onto the street. Off Broadway empties rubbish onto the street, dumps things out, throws oil all over the place, which is dangerous. In the summer months, when it gets hot, you have families that walk down there, children that walk down there that have to witness drunken behaviour, large crowds. So again, I think it's a prevention of harm to children. I think it comes under all of those. I personally, and I believe all the people that I'm representing here, that Off Broadway has been given numerous chances. They have been offered a large number of opportunities to engage with the members of the public, with the police, with the local authority. They have avoided all of those until they were pushed, and even now they are you know, not doing that. I have been asked while this meeting is going on, many are watching on YouTube who couldn't attend, and there are constant text messages coming through from them that they have no faith in anything other than the license being revoked. And so that is what we would ask and push for, because we have no faith in any conditions being adhered to whatsoever going forward. But, excuse me, having said that, if the committee is mindful to not revoke the license, we would request that some serious strict restrictions and conditions are put in place as a last resort. And what we ask for is that the off-sales component is removed completely, that there is, and that this would allow for the tables and chairs to not be used for alcohol outside, but for the consumption of soft drinks and food only. As if they would need to use those tables, they would need to apply for a premises license review of that area to be included in the premises license. We would ask that the licensing hours be reduced to 11 o'clock, because currently they run concurrent. It was clearly pointed out by the police officer. So that allows for a reasonable drinking and closing down time, respectively, so crowds could be dispersed. That the presence of security is present, and actually that all training is done, that camera footage, etc., is all in place, because all of these things have not been adhered to many times. Again, it's all in your documentation. That we ask for the removal of the live music element, because this is actually affecting people, and as both Oliver and I believe Ryan are just a few meters away, and now there is an extension of the area downstairs where the bar was extended to, which is now being currently advertised on their website as for rent as a live venue. that be looked at. And that the premises closes at 11:30, or that the alcohol stops at 11 and premises closes at 11:30. I'm just going to refer to my notes for a second, because I've had a lot of people coming in with things.
Sure.
And just to finalise, we feel that if you're not minded to revoke this licence, that these strong conditions and reassurances were put into place, that going forward that they would be monitored for a period of time to make sure that they actually do stick to these, especially during the coming summer months, when this is when it is much worse for people and residents. And members of the public. It's, you know, we do have complaints that aren't just direct local residents. They are from further afield who are trying to just get down the street or get through or get home. And I could go on, I won't, but thank you very, very much. And I hope that makes our position very clear.
Yeah, it does. I think that a few questions. On the Safer Neighbourhoods Board, do you hold a position on that board?
On the Safer Neighbourhood panel,
Oh, sorry.
London Field Safer Neighbourhood panel, I am the chair. I am also the chair of Hackney Safer Neighbourhood Board. And just on that note, I mean, I'd say that I actually work very closely with Hackney Council's enforcement, Jerry McCarthy, Parks Patrol. We actually orchestrated extra patrols for the area. I worked, as you can imagine, I worked also directly with licensing, previous license manager Andy Durant, and all extra patrols were arranged through that, and especially specific to this bar. Yeah. I'd also point out one thing I forgot. Sorry, I know I'm being cheeky. That when the police had to issue prohibition notices, which were to close down a number of small bars, a number of the bars that were open there. It was only off Broadway that opened up again afterwards, and for several months, apart from a couple of restaurants, Broadway Market was the only bar that opened up and continued to cause problems. Because I believe that extra papers that were submitted at the last minute refer to dates. I would just like you to, when you do look at those dates, that you refer those dates back to the police's comments of attendance, and you will actually see that especially the ones that are around the citizens, the two advertisements in newspaper, you will see that they behaved terribly before and after and solely following the prohibition notice. And I would also like to point out that the number of licensed premises on the market is an issue. It is currently being looked at by the council under license for a saturation zone. And although I know that won't currently come into this, but it is actually looking at those, and that during that time, a large percentage of those, a very large percentage of those listed there, were not open for most of the time that they weren't, that the main restrictions and these times were going on. Sorry, okay. I just took extra time there when you asked a question. I apologise.
The report, the representation that you made here today, had you agreed that with the Safer Neighbourhood panel?
Yes, we did. And the Safer Neighbourhood panel, yes, we did. That was agreed, and it's been minuted. We also, in fact, it's been raised at every meeting that we've had. We also, we agreed that that was the representation we wanted to make, and it was agreed by them. We also, okay. When we meet with the local Safer Neighbourhoods team. So, and we also have council representation and things like that. And it was agreed by all those present at the meeting, including our local Safer Neighbourhood policing team.
Okay, and just to be crystal clear on your position is adding additional licensing conditions won't fix this because Mr. Selby, you don't have faith in Mr. Selby in complying with. The only thing that can really fix this issue is revocation of the license to sell alcohol.
This is both mine and the general consensus from the residents that previously that I'm acting on, and those that couldn't come tonight, and there are about 9 of them that would have definitely been here tonight that I'm responding with via the phone while speaking to you.
So I think that we can only take into account your own representations here and the fact, I assume that Ms. North will correct me if I'm wrong on this, and the fact that you are speaking on behalf of the Safer Neighbourhood panel as well.
Yeah, and these residents that I'm actually mentioning have brought those issues to the panel have contacted me, which was raised at the panel.
Okay, thank you very much. Councillor Root, you have a question?
I do have a question, actually. Just looking at the license, which I think was originally granted in 2008, is that correct? I think it is. It seems to me that this license doesn't have lots of conditions that lots of other licenses in Broadway Market do currently have. And, you know, I imagine one of the things that I found most surprising, actually, hearing the evidence from neighbours, was the attitude of the licensees towards the local residents, and the lack of engagement I find really quite extraordinary. Not least because I'm so used to terms in licenses which insist upon regular engagement with local people and insist upon ways of trying to sort things out. So I suppose the question I'm putting to you, Louise, is how much of these problems do you think is actually caused because a lot of the conditions aren't in the license, and therefore, in a sense, maybe the licensee has felt that he doesn't really need necessarily to take such notice of those issues. And if we were to go through the license and add significant stringent conditions to bring it much more into line with the licenses of his neighbours, then perhaps we might be able to get somewhere without revoking the license. What do you think?
I probably can only speak for myself on this one, but because I know that probably the rest of the people that have come to me that I'm bringing forward tonight would not have faith in anything, because briefly it was discussed, because of the breaches that they have repeatedly made and because of the lack of engagement, and would probably only see that, and I think I probably would only see it as prolonging, and again, you know, it will go quiet for a while and then this will come off and that will kick off and this will go and that will happen, and then we'd have to write in and then it would be that, and it would only prolong, probably more, it would cause more problems. I definitely agree that very, very strict adhered conditions would obviously reduce the problem. Just the outside drinking, you know, from removing off sounds alone would actually probably reduce the issue of that happening. So yes, I suppose you can't argue that it will reduce it by some degree. Whether it will reduce it all and make life easier for residents, to give them a good quality of life, to meet the licensing objectives fully, I couldn't be 100% sure. I wouldn't have 100% faith.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So now what I suggest is that we hear from, not actually from the licensee, but from the other persons who have written in support of the premises and to oppose this review, who are in this meeting under the name Rooney Thompson. Could you decide amongst yourselves who is going to be your spokesperson? Come off mute and speak to us for 5 or so minutes to explain why you've written to oppose this application to revoke the license.
I'll just try and get hold of everyone there, if that's okay.
Oh, okay. Well, in which case, as you're doing that, maybe Mr. Hughes, would you be happy to speak to us in the interim?
Yes, I'm happy to kick off, if that's all right, Chairman.
And how long do you think you'll need to address the issues that we've heard about already?
Well, I suspect about 15 minutes, Chairman.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The first point I'd like to make is that I'd like to invite the committee to look at this in the context of last year. And I suppose you could anticipate this would be an argument that we would put. But I think it's a very strong argument nonetheless, that we're operating here in the context of the pandemic and the regulations that were coming in constantly throughout that period, March 2020 right through to July 2021. Some of the allegations that we have in the papers, and we can only actually deal, as you know, Chairman, what's on the papers, relate to matters in June of 2020, and then it fast forward to April 2021 and May 21 and June 21. So against that backdrop, we have, of course, obviously the pandemic affecting every hospitality outlet in the land, and regulations coming out there on a weekly, sometimes on a daily basis. And the problem with the regulations was there was no consultation prior to any of them coming in, as you would normally expect with regulations. And there was no parliamentary debate, which is one of the complaints being levelled at them. And so the only thing we had was guidance that assisted us. And the guidance often wasn't saying the same thing as what was contained in the regulations. And furthermore, there was no real bedding in period for regulations before a new set came out. And I was constantly advising, as a barrister, along with Gary Grant, Charles Hall, and other barristers, on the amendments to the regulations, which were coming out sometimes on a daily basis. The debate more or less centred on what the law was saying and what the guidance was saying, and sometimes the guidance wasn't catching up with the regulations and so on and so forth. And you remember issues about Scotch eggs and so on at the end of 2020, when everything got a bit out of hand. And I think local authorities as well, because I was advising them, police, I was advising them, were often confused. Regulations were interpreted differently in certain areas. I had a case with Lambeth and Wandsworth Police, both entirely interpreting some of the regulations about outdoor consumption of alcohol quite differently in their respective areas, particularly about the operating from kiosks point, which also changed as time went on. So there was some confusion. And of course, I think that that's been highlighted more or less by the difficulties coming out of the Prime Minister's office in number 10, the main instigator of the regulations, if you like, and all the difficulties we're seeing there about interpretation of regs. And Mr. Hancock, the previous Health Secretary, was the signatory to these regulations, who also got himself to a terrible mess on social distancing. Now, looking at Mr. Selby and his case in that context, there are, as we've heard in the hearing so far, 20 premises licenses odd in this street. I act all over London, the country, and it's probably a street where I don't think there are as many premises licenses I've seen in a long time in one particular street as this one. So there are a lot there, attracting a lot of people on a regular basis. And in November 2020, a prohibition notice was served, it's true to say, but at that time there were, as I understand it, 21 prohibition notices served on that very self-same occasion in November 2020, reported by Councillor Nicholson in the news and so on. But no fixed penalty notices were ever issued against Off-Broadway. There was no closure notice as such, no closure, as I say, there was a closure notice. But I think in terms of that, and it relates to the Business and Planning Act 2020 in this context about the use of the rear garden area, I'll come to that in a second if I may, it doesn't actually mean you have to close when you get a closure notice. It's quite a confusing nomenclature. You're only required to close when there's a closure order that comes after the closure notice, and it's incumbent upon the council, if they seek total closure of the premises, to use that closure notice and go off to the magistrate's court and obtain a closure order which would have that effect. And you can only do that outside, I think it's 7 days and before 6 months has expired. So effectively that closure notice is now expired in any event. No summary reviews issued by the police, and I've known Miss Ryan for many, many years, and she's often instigated summary reviews herself in the borough, as you'll be aware, but there was no summary review in this case. And if asked the question, if they were as bad as suggested, and we say they weren't, why was that not done as a summary review or even a regular normal review? And no COVID reviews at all during that period either. So if I could look at the complaints, if I may, and I try and group these together rather than go through every single one. There are, interestingly, none from the Environmental Health Officer of the Council. You've done many reviews, Chairman, I know, where you've seen your own Environmental Health Officer from Community Protection and Enforcement come in front of you, and they have nothing to say about this issue. They're obviously a standard consultee, nothing to say here, just the police and the licensing officer. In regard to the first tranche of complaints, which occurred in about June of 2020, July, August, just as the country, if you may recall, was opening up after the first lockdown, was it? I can't remember, but the first lockdown on the 4th of July. So some of the complaints you've received there relate to that specific period. Everyone was coming out of that period wanting to go out for drinks and enjoy themselves. As you remember, the government offered incentives for people to go out and eat and drink, cost of their food and so on. And for a short period, the hospitality sector boomed during that July-August period. But what we have here, I think, is complaints about some of the tables and chairs at the front and some observations. And Mr. Selby makes the point that at that point, he thinks the road was actually closed. So we weren't obstructing traffic or anything else during that time, but he'll answer that question in more detail a little later on. Crowds are outside all of our premises, of course, during that period of time, and not all, in this context, in the context of Broadway, were they from off-Broadway, we would submit. There are, as we said, 20 other licensed premises in this street and a lot of people milling around them. And some of the pictures that were submitted, I think, by Ms. Greenwood, I hope I pronounced her name correctly, actually show two ladies at a table enjoying themselves, not causing a rowdy behaviour or anything of the sort. So those are the issues in 2020. Then you move forward, I think, to the period in April 2021, where again, you're coming out of a closing down period. And you remember, sir, that you're coming into the sort of tiered process of coming out of the lockdown as stage 1, 2, and 3, and so on. And a lot of the matters set out by Mr. Gardner, particularly 14 of them, I think, are grouped under this one heading of problem with the tables and chairs in the rear garden area. And I think this is down to Mr. Selby, we must hold our hand up on this one, misinterpreting the Business and Planning Act of 2020. Now, Chairman and members, if you recall, that act came in at the back end of 2020 to allow for tables and chairs on the public highway, in other words, to open up the sector and to allow people to eat outdoors instead of inside. Now, I think looking at them, numbers 7, 8, 13, 14, 15, 16, 18, 22, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 31 of Mr. Gardner's incidents all relate to that tables and chairs matter. Mr. Selby, I think, now readily admits that he misinterpreted that law. He was looking at guidance published by the government, which said, take your tables and chairs outside. What he didn't realise, I think, was that his rear garden is not public highway. Nonetheless, when he was told about that, he removed the tables and chairs, removed the use of the garden, if you like. So that happened in June 21. I believe hasn't happened since. He did at the same time have an application for planning permission in, which was subsequently refused in any event. He'll correct me if I'm wrong on that one. Mr. Gardner's other matters, RG6 in your papers, that's not really a complaint. It's speculative as to what might happen in the future on the 12th of April. Number 7 is not a complaint, but merely an observation because the premises were closed at that point. This is the 10th of April, 2021. Number 9 is not an incident again, because that's referring to a tweet which had occurred a few years before. And we have no knowledge of a license application going in 2015. Number 11, again, we say is not a complaint about public nuisance or antisocial behaviour, because it refers to an Instagram photograph 3 or 4 years before. And neither is number 14. That, Mr. 14, is Mr. Tewitt's letter, which attached the closure notice to it, which I referred to a little earlier on, so I won't labour that one again. And number 17, again, we say is not a complaint because it's a copy of the closure notice and what Mr. Selby is required to do as a result of receiving that notice, which effectively was to close the rear garden, which of course is now what he's done in any event. And there are other matters there, 31, 32 and 33, which we say are not complaints. But looking at some of the complaints that have been raised, RG10, this is a complaint that's come through. We don't know who it's from. I presume it's from some of the individuals who are here this evening. This was a complaint about social distancing, but we say in that respect that we had the tables and chairs operating to the rule of 6 in any event. RG12, which relates to May 21, refers to bins being put out irregularly. We say that those bins are awaiting collection by Hackney. Evidence of sick on the pavement from a photograph from 4 days previously, but we have no evidence that that person came out of off-Broadway. Mr. Selby tells me that he power washes the pavement in any event after each day's activities. And grease, we simply don't know what that refers to. Mrs. Brewood referred to that. Mr. Selby says we don't use grease and certainly don't pour it away in that way, so we're not quite clear where that has come from. RG19 relates to off sales from off-Broadway to people sitting and standing in Derricote. But again, we say that there are more licensed premises in this street, and a lot of people from those other premises come and congregate at the top of Derricote, which has this gate. I don't know if you're aware of it, Chairman and members. It has this new gate put in, which a lot of people tend to rest their drinks on. And when I went up there, I saw people actually resting their drinks on this gate and sitting on it. Mr. Selby himself complained about that gate for some time to the council because it is an attraction. RG20 refers to an awning which was put up outside the premises. Well, Mr. Selby has always used that awning since 2008, so I'm not sure that that's a great complaint. It's argued that it's encouraged to keep people in there out of the rain, but we say we've been using it since 2008 in any event. There are other allegations about urination and people drinking outside, but again, none of these specifically pinned down off-Broadway individuals. There are some that say they're off-Broadway individuals, but with regard to vast numbers, we say that some of them come from the other premises. And indeed, there's an off license, which I think is open for later hours, right opposite this licensed premises. And in terms of the police, Miss Ryan, of course, came before you, and she's put a letter in, which, of course, is in your papers. And what we say about that is we did respond to that visit. It was done as a response, we think, of a long queue being shown in the national press outside the premises, which attached itself, it appeared, to the coffee shop next door, which is very popular. And when I was there, it was very popular as well. And there was a long line forming outside the premises, but the photograph in that article showed that Mr. Selby's premises was closed on that occasion, although it did open up later on. And there was a visit from the police, I think, relating to that. And Mr. Selby agreed with them then certain procedures about the queuing system for alcohol and hot food, that he would deploy full-time door staff presence, and he does that through Lion Protection Limited, that he would have radio buzzers for his door staff to disperse customers who were waiting for hot food, that he would clearly mark the queuing lines outside into Derricote Street for people to stand in an orderly fashion. He discussed with them the barriers that he would put up to keep people again in an orderly fashion, and that there would be no contact payment system, as well as his cups and glasses being marked so that they could easily be identified as coming from off-Broadway. So that may be what Mr. Gardner was referring to earlier on in his introduction as some conditions that were agreed with the police. I think that's what Mr. Selby informed the police he would do at that meeting in November 2020, as Kerry Ryan refers to. So in summing up, and I hope I'm getting it in with the time given, we would ask that the nuclear trigger of a revocation be not pressed on this occasion. This is a premises which, as you've seen from the supporters, is well established in the area and rather historic. The issues all occurred during the middle of the pandemic in our submission. We've heard that there might have been things before and after, but that's not in the papers in front of you on the evidence produced from Mr. Gardner or the police. Mr. Selby lives in the area. He's lived in the house where the premises is located. His father lives above. His father's lived there for 50 years. Mr. Selby's lived there for nearly 50 years. And he's got 2 children, his 2-year-old and a baby he's had this week. You may have seen the picture earlier on. And they all live in the, well, I think they don't live in there now because Mr. Selby Senior has to socially distance because I think he's just had a COVID diagnosis. But the two are very well embedded in this street and have been for many years. And Mr. Selby is himself chairman of the local business association, and he'll give you evidence of that when he speaks. So this is not, we submit, sir, a question of breaches over many, many years since 2008, antisocial behaviour, fighting, crime and disorder, which you might hear outside other premises, of violence occurring, underage sales and so on. And we don't think this is obviously suitable for closure with the loss of jobs and livelihoods and the activity in the area. And finally, those supporters who you see in front of you, Chairman, of which there are 85, some of them, it is true to say, I think as Ms. Brewood said, just one-liners, but if the majority of them are addressing themselves to the licensing objectives of public nuisance and saying they don't see it as a public nuisance in their view, and the majority of those, as you can see from the addresses, actually live in the area. So, sir, I don't want to go through all of those. They're there in front of you. You've read the papers. But suffice it to say that they should not, in my respectful submission, be treated lightly. The whole process about the Licensing Act and what we have in front of us tonight is this great process of democracy, which allows residents from all parts of the argument to come in front of you and to put their case. And these residents have taken time to write these letters in. It's not just, there was a petition, but this has not been done in the form of a petition. They're actual letters. And you can read all the helpful comments that they've put in there. You may hear from some of them in a minute. Sir, in all the circumstances, we would ask you not to revoke. There has been some talk about conditions. If I think Mr. Gardner had suggested these conditions in October, November, we might have been ready to write some conditions down if we felt that they would have assisted Mr. Gardner or Ms. Ryan going forward. But anyway, we've seen what Mr. Selby has said in terms of his discussions with the police in November 2020. And if there are further conditions, I thought your suggestion at the start, Chairman, if I may say, was eminently sensible way of proceeding. If you are minded to go down that route of not revoking and attaching conditions, then maybe it is something that we can agree with Mr. Gardner and Mrs. Ryan in due course. But I may say that was a sensible suggestion, so if you will allow me to say that. But that's me, and I don't know if you want to hear Mr. Selby, who will be able to obviously answer questions about the details of some of the things that have been said about him.
Before we do that, I think it might be helpful for me to just ask a couple of questions of clarification. But that said, Councillor Jana Thomas has had a hand up for some time. Councillor Jana Thomas.
Thanks, Chair. I just, sorry, the barrister, you haven't got your name, you got unknown, so
I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Chairman. It's Gareth Hughes.
Okay, Mr. Hughes, thanks very much for addressing the committee. But I just need a sort of clarification from you in terms of, it will appear to me that you have trivialized all the residents' complaints and make a definition of ASB in a way. ASB is not just behavior that causes nuisance or annoyance. They're harmful and distressing, as you've heard from one of the people earlier on about their mental health. Or when you look at the summary of what residents have put forward, you can see noise, nuisance, harassment, and intimidation, environmental ASB, and all of that together. Of course, we want is the balance that is important to us, supporting businesses at the same time, residents being there. But what you were saying is because there's no clarity around the confusion around regulations and guidance around COVID, this is why this has happened. And I'm not too sure if that is what you were saying, that this complaint from residents both noise, harassment, intimidation, environmental, ASB are just because your client was confused around regulations and guidance. Is that what I heard? Or do you want to clarify that? Or are you saying there was no ASB in all of this?
Well, thank you, Councillor, for the question. No, I'm not saying there is nothing down or due to our client at all. I say in terms of the use of the rear garden area, there was a clear mistake there about what the Business and Planning Act allowed for. Mr. Selby assumed he could put, based on the guidance, I've read the guidance, he felt he could put tables and chairs in his own rear garden area, which he clearly couldn't do that. And when I got involved, I reminded him of that. He already had a planning application in any event for the use of that, and that's been refused. So that's the end of that matter, really. He can't use that now in the way he's been using it. But there was a mistake there about what the Business and Planning Act allowed for licensed premises, if you recall, Councillor, to take their tables and chairs onto the highway. So that's point one. I think in terms of the second point, the general position on the lockdown regulations, yes, there was a lot of confusion caused by that, who you could have outside. There was a lot of difficulties with policing across London, premises that were selling from kiosks as crowds gathered in the streets, particularly young people, of course, who wanted to just be out, and how they were making those orders through telephones or going up to the kiosk, and where they were waiting to get their order for the pint of beer or whatever. So confusion about that. Confusion, I think, about the position in relation to the tables and chairs on the front. Mr. Selby has had an old-style Highways Act permit for that area, not the Business and Planning Act permit, but the Highways Act permit for many, many years. And so I think in terms of the use of those tables, Rule of 6 and so on, there may have been confusion there. But don't get me wrong, Councillor, I think we have to say that some of these incidents, which some residents have seen, are attributable to off-Broadway. But what we do say is that given that there are 21 other licensed premises here, and I think a 24-hour off license, Mr. Selby will correct me if I'm wrong, opposite, we are not the sole cause of this, that there are hundreds of people milling around off Broadway every night. The Cat and Mutton, I think, opposite is a huge, huge, substantial outdoor area with umbrellas and tables and chairs put up outside it, and many people walking up and down. So I think we have to say for some of these, they may very well be down to us, but not all of them by any means. And there is no evidence in some cases that people have been seen coming out of off-Broadway, whilst in others there is. So I'm just saying it's a matter of balance, Councillor.
Mr. Hughes, but people witness, the police, our officers witness this in the premises. They had conversation with your client. He's not, they're not just hearsay, or when we don't know where these are coming from. There are conversations with your client. So that is that's my point.
Well, yes, maybe Mr. Selby can answer the detail about what happened in those conversations, and could probably answer them better than I could, Councillor.
Ms. North.
Yes, sorry, I was just going to add an additional question through the chair to just clarify. Prior to today, what actions has the licence holder taken to try and overcome the objections from the local residents, or has there been any attempt to work with them prior to today?
Well, again, Mr. Selby may be able to answer that better than I can.
And I think we'll come to Mr. Selby in a moment. I think I have another few things, but already I think I'm not sure that Mr. Selby is assisted by any comparison with national politicians who've decided that their rules don't apply to them. And I think the suggestion that they were motivated by uncertainty as to the application of those rules rather than towering arrogance and thinking that those rules don't apply to them is mistaken. But in any case, you mentioned there's a difference between a closure notice and a closure order, and I think this was in relation to the beer garden. But there was uncertainty as to, in Mr. Selby's mind, as to the application of the relevant legislation at the time. But the closure notice, from my reading of the papers, seems to give the licensing authorities view that the use of the garden was unlawful and fell outside of the scope of the license, and indeed wasn't covered by the legislation. So, I mean,
well, yes.
although what you're saying is that there needs to be a formal closure order issued by a court in order for use of the license, for that closure to be backed up by some sort of sanction, it was still unlawful, wasn't it? And it was still communicated to Mr. Selby by the licensing authority.
Well, yes, Chairman, but of course, local authorities and police officers, dare I say, are not always right, and they're often challenged in courts and found to be wrong. But in this case, what I would say is that Mr. Selby, at this point, and I think this is in May of 2021, so the country was starting to open up again at that point, if you remember. We were going through, I think, 3 phases up to July the 19th, weren't we? And I think this was the early part. And I think that in terms of the Business and Planning Act, he assumed that he could put those tables and chairs directly into his rear garden, which he couldn't. That was incorrect. And I think a month later, he ceased it anyway.
Okay. And then just this question of prohibition notices. I'm not sure that I followed this point. There are a number of prohibition notices that were issued in respect of 21 premises, we're saying, in the vicinity. And we heard that other premises did not open, but off-Broadway did. Is there a suggestion here that there was some flouting of the notice? Is that what the suggestion is?
Well, maybe it's the first time I heard that one, Chairman, and again, I could only put that one to Mr. Selby to answer because he was actually there.
Okay, well, in which case, if no one else has any further questions of clarification from Mr. Hughes, then maybe Mr. Selby, if you, Ms. North.
I think Louise Brewood put something in the chat, but unfortunately we're not supposed to have chat things. But if she wanted to make her comment instead.
Yes, if you could. Can't hear you. You're on mute.
Sorry, I did it again. It was just to update you on the tables and chairs that outside shop premises, bars, restaurants, etc. You have to apply for a license. It doesn't matter how long you've had that license. It's renewed every single year with regulations, and those regulations are clearly outlined and defined, and they are clearly marked. And working with the markets department and the shopfront team, many residents were directed by me and the police and off their own backs to actually raise the breaches of this and the use of over expansion. And could I just also, on the point of tables and chairs, sorry, I've forgotten your name, to the lawyer, if you're referring to the photograph of the ladies at the bench, at the wooden bench, in the document that I put in, that was a wooden bench that was placed in the actual road outside on the private residential street in an area that isn't licensed under the table and chairs or anywhere near the license. In fact, it actually states in the document, off-Broadway's documents somewhere, that they're not allowed to actually use or enter or anything in that area. And that was when I passed up there, people were drinking in that area, which they shouldn't have been. And they shouldn't have tables and chairs there at all. It was on the actual road, on the residential street.
So
thank you.
I think there were a number of legal points there, and Ms. North, you were nodding, so it sounds as if you agree with those points. I'm very conscious that we still need to hear from Mr. Selby and from the other persons who hopefully have sort of corralled themselves into and identified a spokesperson. Before we do so, Mr. Hughes was I'm hesitant to open this up to a debate, but I think, Mr. Hughes, you do need to respond to what was just been said if you think you need to.
Well, I haven't seen that. Miss Brewood, of course, is absolutely right that what I've been talking about is the rear area and the Business and Planning Act. The front area is conducted by the Highways Act 1980, a Highways Act permit, as it were, which Hackney have issued. My office has applied for many as the years have gone by. And it's quite right that you have to maintain within the certain parameters as set out in that Highways Act permit. But I'm not sure what was happening on that particular day, frankly. And again, Mr. Selby, I'm sorry, Chairman, I seem to be deferring to poor old Mr. Selby all the time, but having not been there on the day that photograph was taken, I can't tell you what exactly was going on.
So, Mr. Selby, if you could just address us on any of the points that have been made.
Mr. Chairman, could I ask a request that we refer to the people in London first, because my father's quite elderly, and it would be helpful if we could speak to them before me, if that would be okay with you.
Absolutely. And have they identified someone?
Yes, their spokesman's called Nick Ross.
Mr. Ross, if you could unmute and then talk to us for no more than 5 minutes, then I think that would be helpful.
Hello.
Hello.
Mr. Selby?
Yes, I'm here.
We have Mr. Selby here.
Good evening.
Hello. Was there anything that you wanted to say about this application by the licensing authority to revoke the license of that premises?
Well, it's very difficult because it's not a general question. So if you want to ask a specific question to me, I'd be very happy to answer. But I would like to say that one of the most important things here is about community. And with the complaints that as I understand, with the very few people who have made these complaints, are basic newcomers to an area which is, the bar has been going for 12 years now, and it was my premises before that. And I think where I would like to start with regards to the community, in 1978, Broadway Market was scheduled to be demolished for a feeder route for the motorway. And myself and my friend, the late Stuart Goodman, went to the GLC, as it was then, and we had our time with the leader of the GLC and invited him to join us as we had put a festival on, a carnival, especially with the community, to try and save the market and the principle of its existence in the first place. And the 3 MPs locally, Ron Brown, brother of George Brown, and Margaret Morgan, and I forget the other one at the moment, the name of the other one. And we had a brilliant day, and I then received a letter from the head of the GLC to say that Broadway Market was saved. Now, had it not been for that, we would not be here. It would have been a road. And then the Saturday market, and I see Louise there in the middle of my screen, was one of those who, with myself and just a few others, actually decided to bring the market to life again. And we did, and it was probably one of the most successful markets London, a new revived markets that London has ever seen. And even to this day, now that it's run by the council, it's still pretty successful. But the point is, it's about community. New people who come here and start complaining about something that has been well established and maybe a bit noisier than other places, but it's a commercial street. And we have taken great pride in remaking Broadway Market into a place worth living in. The most important thing subsequently has been with the gentrification, the rents being very high, and it is no longer the mixed community that it used to be. It is now full of people who come here and live here for a short time and move on. They do not have a sense of community like we who have been here for many years. And unfortunately, this is how you get complaints with people who move in and do not understand that when you live on a commercial street, that you have to enjoy it or don't live here. And I'm sorry, there's not much more for me to say. Community is everything, and I'm afraid community is the thing that is suffering more in this world than anything else. And I think I've said enough.
Thank you, Mr. Selby. Have you had an opportunity to read the papers for this evening's licensing subcommittee meeting?
No, I haven't, I'm afraid.
Okay. There are a number of suggestions from a lengthy document from the licensing authority, representations from the police, from the Safer Neighbourhoods panel, and from a number of residents, to the effect that the off-Broadway is causing a lot of nuisance and antisocial behaviour and breaching its licence in a number of ways. In light of that, should this subcommittee revoke the licence for off-Broadway?
If you're talking about the complaints, not necessarily from the immediate people, but maybe from general noise, a lot of the complaints have come, and I live right above the bar, and I'm there every night, and even during the summers when it's very hot. And a lot of the people are there buying their beers from the local off licenses because they're cheap, and they stay out there until maybe 3 o'clock in the morning sometimes, and they're told to move on. And unfortunately, the bars, not just off Broadway, but even the Cat and Mutton, have this problem. Now, when Tony Blair introduced the thing about late night licensing, and people were able to go and buy beer from a supermarket at 2 o'clock in the morning, yet bars had got their own existing restrictions from usually 11 o'clock at night and maybe 12 o'clock on weekends. And the bars got the blame for the drinkers who were buying the beers from the supermarkets. And I'm afraid that still goes on. And the police would be coming in and blaming people who were casual drinkers with their beers from the supermarket and blamed the pubs for the problem. And I'm afraid this never stopped. And there is your big problem. I put this complaint in when I was chair of the BMTRA many years ago, that it was a contradiction to have beer available from supermarkets at 2 o'clock in the morning when pubs had to close earlier. And of course, these were the people who were making the noise, not the people who were in the pubs. Still goes on. So I'm afraid that if this contradiction is never sorted out, you will have this problem about complaints. Simple.
Okay.
Logic.
Thank you very much. I've got with me two other councillors, Councillor Penny Rout and Councillor Susan Thomas. Councillor Rout, I think you had a question, or not?
It was really just an observation that you know, whilst I appreciate how long Mr. Selby's been in the area and all that he's done for the area, community does evolve and change and shape. And one of the things that I've been quite surprised about is how little the establishment has sought to engage with those people who are around them. And you know, if this revocation isn't to happen, I would think that part of the license conditions that we'd want to include would have some fairly stringent terms for engaging with the community and taking note of what the community is having to say, whether they're newbies or they've been there for 50 years. And I just rather hope that you might take that on board and you know, take the community in the round, I suppose, rather than just the those who've been there for a long time.
Okay, you don't need to respond to that, Mr. Selby. I think this is something that we're going to take into the account later on. But Councillor Fajana Thomas also appears to have a question.
Thanks, Chair. My question is actually in regards, but I will push forward to what Councillor Ruth just said to Mr. Selby. In your statement, you've mentioned the fact of newcomers. And to me, I sort of get, or probably I would like you to clarify, or are you saying to us that some people are more important than others on Broadway, that people that move in, the newcomers, don't matter? Because I sort of get that from what you just told us about the newcomers that are complaining. Some people more are not equal on Broadway, please?
That's a very interesting point. Thank you very much for it. Newcomers, not only are newcomers, but they're also short stayers. So tendency is for the landlords these days, most of the landlords are not around, they put their rents up so frequently that people can't afford to stay here. So they come in, they've been here, they've had their year or two or maybe even three, but not much longer. So you'll find that most of the tenants around here are very short term. So it is not a question of newbies as much as it is temporaries. And so if people do complain when they move into the countryside and complain about the church bells, which have been going there for years and years and years, and expect the church bells to be stopped on Sunday mornings because it wakes them up, then, you know, I'm sorry, but you really should actually accept the style of what is going on around you. And maybe before you move in, you should actually investigate and find out what the place is like that you're moving into. And if you're going to be a freeholder, I mean, I made the mistake moving into the countryside. We lived near a pig farm. We didn't know about it when we bought the place. And in the summertime, we had to shut the windows because of the smell. So everybody that moves should actually look at what they're going to live with. What are they moving into? Broadway Market is a very successful, and it is a commercial shopping centre and now a restaurant centre. And you know, you should never move into a place unless you
Sorry to interrupt you, Mr. Selby. You're not answering my question. My question is, are you saying some people on Broadway Market are more important than others? Are you saying that people are not equal, that people that are moving in or living there temporarily as residents don't matter?
I am not saying that. There is no one person more important than the other. It is to do with those who move in should make sure that they know what they're moving into. That's common sense, but I'm afraid that they don't all do that. So nobody's more important than any other.
Thank you very much for that. I think we would like to hear from your son, if your son has anything to add to this.
Hello. There are two other people there that have submitted. Do you want them to add their points, or can they be dismissed because time is pressing? It's getting late, very late for everyone.
Yeah. So I had hoped that Mr. Russell, or indeed your father, had been the spokesperson for those other people, and I think, given the time, that we've read their representation. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll speak on then, if that would be okay.
Sure.
Okay. I'll just try and go back because obviously there's an awful lot of points rising. We had a meeting with the Mr. Hughes Council on the 20th of October, We suggested the following 3 items: arranging mediation with the neighbours, completing a sound survey, and not drinking outside, and then not giving people takeaway cups at close. Many bars in Hackney, this is all prior to COVID, used to give people glasses to clear away the customers at midnight. It's much easier to get rid of people if you give them takeaway glasses, but this encourages people to linger outside, which has been an issue. Obviously, living upstairs, I'm very aware of it. So we've done that continually since this meeting. So there've been no drinks outside at all after 10 o'clock, and there'd be no takeaway clubs. The time's called 11:45, and people are pushed out the door at 12 o'clock midnight. Obviously, I can't stop them going across the road to Broadway Wine, but once they've got a tin in their hand, I do regard that as an Broadway Wine's responsibility. The outside garden, I do accept that I did the wrong thing. I read the government legislation which said please use your car park to keep customers outside, and I used my car park, which is what the area is. This was a wrong interpretation of the law. I made a mistake. This was only for the time that we weren't allowed customers inside. So the day that the legislation allowed customers inside, I closed my rear garden. And it did close at 6 o'clock every day. No one was ever out there past the hours of 6 p.m. So I wasn't disturbing anyone at night with the rear garden. I'd just like to say that was always the case. I did have my birthday party there as a private event in May, but that was the only event that went later, and that was nothing to do with the bar. I did invite the nearest neighbour to it, but she couldn't attend. Right. Separately to that, just some other points. I'm as I said, my brief said earlier, I'm the chairman of the BMTRA. I also run broadwaymarket.co.uk website and have done for many years, and do a lot of pro bono work, formerly with Louise at the BMTRA, and now I just maintain the website and attend meetings. We get complaints every week about the setup of the market on Saturday mornings from residents who don't like the fact there's a street market and it makes noise. So it is an ongoing problem with the noise issues in Broadway Market. I've lived on the street for many years, so the Cat and Mutton had big issues with this about 5 years ago. The Dove had big issues with this with neighbours about 10 years ago, and obviously this is the issues that we're having now. Prior to 2020, we had almost no complaints about noise. So this is all post-COVID. Since we've gone back to a more normal style of trade, all the complaints seem to have died away. So this is very much a COVID issue. We heard from my direct neighbour, who I share a wall with. I think Ryan and Oliver live together, but if not, they're in the flat one above another, above Clemson's, which is a coffee shop to the side. I have met them once in the street when they were quite angry about the rear garden. I'm very approachable. I'm chairman of the local residents association. I live next door to them and we share a wall, and they have both my phone number and my email address. They've never tried to arrange a meeting with me. Despite the fact we reached out with the idea of mediation, they've not responded to that. I've done everything I can to approach both them, the neighbours to the rear, and the neighbour opposite, who both of whom moved in during the pandemic. They were particularly concerned with queuing in Derrickett Street, which was done with lines drawn by Hackney Council for queuing in April 2020. So the council were actively encouraging queuing at that time in April 2020, and the line stayed down until we stopped trading on the 4th of January 2021, when the nationwide curfew came in for alcohol, although food was continued to be sold. On another matter, Kerry Ryan, there's mention of conversations. There was one conversation by phone with Kerry. I just had a baby and it could have been more courteous, and I apologise for that. A bad lack of sleep does things to you. I'm going through that again now. So we were quite annoyed, given the fact that most of the customers identified as being problematic were clearly drinking tins of beer that I had not supplied. I had security on all the way through that 2-month period, every day, all the time we were open, which stemmed from a discussion I had earlier with Sean Giles, who suggested that we do that to maintain are queuing because my bar is more popular than the other venues. And we ran security all the way through, and we made sure that anyone drinking out of our clearly marked glasses was dispersed. We did the very best we can. It was a bit hectic on 2 occasions, both of them Saturdays, and both because the market was run, which wasn't a good idea and had to be closed down with police closures, and obviously we closed at the same time as that happened. We were only asked to close the bar on 1 occasion, which I believe was a Sunday night. Nick could answer to that. I was away at the moment with a small child, but when asked to do so, we closed immediately, whilst the 2 nearest venues, Broadway Mines and El Ganzo, who are less than 50 feet away, continued trading all night. So I don't know why we were singled out on that occasion. I held a meeting about the barrier, which is probably 60% of the problems that we're having are to do with the barrier that was erected in Derrickett Street. There was a barrier there when the market opened in 2004-05. It was removed, and then when the anti-terrorist security devices came to be fitted, they moved the old barrier that was on Derrickett Street down to, outside the Cat and Mutton down to Derrickett Street. I had a meeting with Street Scene. I'm unusually managed to get hold of Street Scene, and all the people and the stakeholders involved with the council and local residents, all of whom said, please, please, please don't put the barrier there. It will lead to people congregating outside, and it's done so, and it's been a thorn in the side for as long as it's been there, which I think is coming on for 5 years. I know that there's currently reasons why it needs to be there, because the market's closed to traffic, but it is a problem, and anything that we could come up with to mitigate that issue would be ongoing. My father didn't say, but I think he did say in a statement earlier, all the bars, including us, were closed on the 4th of January. Obviously, I look out my window. People were drinking tins of beer in numbers greater than 6 on that barrier, all the way through till reopening in April. It's a place that people congregate, and that's not good. And it was put in years and years and years after opening the bar, maybe 8 years after we opened the bar, that barrier went back in. It was not there when we opened in 2008. And that has been one of the problems. Just to go back to the the DPS, I am the DPS. I've been the DPS since November 2020. I submitted all the forms to Hackney Council with my number. I've yet to have a response, but I have been listed, and the police have recognised me at the DPS on at least one. I think Sean recognised I was the DPS in our meeting. So the police are aware that I'm the DPS. So that to clear up that issue about who the DPS is. At no point has there been no DPS, because obviously it would be illegal to sell alcohol. We are the butt of many, many complaints due to the fact we're a bar and a music venue, which we've been since 2010, fully soundproofed. And we're the only music venue on Broadway Market that still exists. There were several, but they all closed down in the 90s. I had a complaint from Mr. Tompkins, who spoke earlier on the 11th of January of this year, complaining about horrible noises coming from a bar. On inspection, it transpired that it was his own downstairs neighbour, Clemson's Coffee Bar, that was making the noise. And he has apologised to me for the confusion. But yet again, it's off-Broadway that seems to take the hint of all the complaints, assuming that we're making the noise, when obviously it's a busy road. There are plant noises coming from the fish shop, from the butchers over the road, from many restaurants with fans, and indeed we try and keep ours to a minimum. I have the lowest output beer fridge on record. I have very seldom used the air conditioning, and my ice machines are regularly maintained and super quiet. I don't want to be Louise Brewood and I see she's just gone off. I'm sure she's there. Have unfortunately somewhat of a rambunctious past. I will point out that she does live well over 100 yards from the bar, not the 50 she stated earlier. There's been somewhat of a family feud going on for a while, and that's unfortunate. And I think I should just mention that, because there is some bad blood. Nothing on my part. I've got the utmost respect for what Louise did to form the market, but there was a rival organisation to the Residents Association. She has a rival organisation, also recognised by the council, which I was not allowed to join. So that goes back a bit from there. But as I say, I've got the utmost respect for Louise and all the work she's done over the years. I think that was covering. Right, someone mentioned earlier the SIA on the licence. While there's not a stipulation, we've had an SIA in place every Friday and Saturday since 2008. I wouldn't operate a bar on Broadway Market without an SIA, and I'm happy for that to be reinforced if you want the license. Lines Protection have done us very well over the years, and they managed to keep the trouble away to the extent we've never ever had the police called for fracas ever. Most of the time we're contacted by the police, it's to use our extensive CCTV system because there've been a violent spate of muggings, mostly by bicycles since the beginning of lockdown and the closure of Broadway Market to traffic in April 2020. Right, sorry, I'm just going back through my notes. There's quite a lot to go through. Yep, and one last thing, my barrister stated that 21 licensed premises in Broadway Market. Actually, it's much higher than that. There are 21 licensed premises within 100 yards of off-Broadway. That's so many licensed premises, and I take the point that it's a glut of licensed premises. 3 new licensed premises have opened up in the last 3 months, I think, one opposite and 2 slightly further down the road. And there are the council are continuing to issue licenses, so there are an awful lot of licensed premises, and there's a lot of options of buying alcohol and consuming it. So that's what I'd like to say. Just to go back over the main point that Councillor Rout made, I do consider that as chairman of the Local Residents Association, as a neighbour with an adjoining wall, as someone who's very visible on the market, and because I've been there for a long time, known to most people that live and work on the market, I do feel I'm approachable. I'll always take time to have a meeting with someone. I don't hide my phone number. My email address is readily available. I have a manager in place at all times who will relay this information to me. We did change managers last year. COVID staffing was very difficult, but my manager, Rennie Thompson, is long trained and an excellent man. And I do consider that people should be able to approach me. I do not understand why my direct neighbours didn't choose to do so, or say, can we just sit down and try and sort out these issues between us? I do understand that coming from another part of London or the country and moving to Broadway Market might be a shock. I've lived upstairs for a long time. It's difficult to keep your windows open on a hot summer evening in midweek, whether you're opposite the Cat and Mun or us or the Dove, all of whom put out pretty much the same noise levels. The Dove have a tables and chairs license till 11. The Cat now have been restricted 10 o'clock. We're sticking to 10 o'clock. And the point my father made is whatever we do, if there are people standing outside the shop when our shutters are down and we're closed, drinking tins of beer from the other side of the road, which I know from our sales figures, we never ever sell drinks after midnight. We tend to get the blame for it. The second day after we opened in 2008, one of my neighbours, an old friend of Louise and mine, who lives opposite, walked up and said, there are people drinking Red Stripe from your bar. I've never sold Red Stripe. But it's one of those things by association. And I think because of the shock of reopening and the shock of the fact that Broadway Market's a very loud place, people got used to the quietness. I mean, I'm sure the people in Isleworth suddenly had a shock when all the planes started going again after 6 months. But there we are. It is a busy street, and we will do our utmost to mitigate it in line with all the other businesses.
Thank you very much. It was a very full and systematic answer to those points made. Councillor Root, Councillor Fajana-Thompson, I think you put your hand up first.
Oh, thanks, Chair. I'll be brief. Mr. Selby, you have there is this issue of not engaging with residents, which you've dismissed that is not the case. But both council officers and police, in their submission, they've mentioned the same thing around not engaging, being rude, argumentative. And I just want, because like many residents have said, or they don't have confidence in, if we are mindful to say we're not going to revoke your license, but want to put conditions in that you're going to adhere to these conditions. And or I cannot, I didn't hear from your or statement the level of engagement with both council officers and the police in the past. You've said you've available, approachable, expecting residents to speak to you, but the officers and police that have done so, they've met with rudeness, and according to them, they said they've claimed they've met with rudeness and argument. So what do you say about that?
I'll repeat. I won't repeat what I said earlier about being the local resident, but a residents' association representative. But I reached out to everyone via the council to engage in mediation. That's usually a really good way of doing this. It'd probably be similar to a divorce mediation, where there's a trained mediation lawyer. All the interested parties sit down for a period of time, something like half a day. I'd cover the costs of it. And we try and find a way of resolving issues as best we can, making sure lines of communication are open and procedures are in place should there be any issues. Obviously, I cited earlier an example of the neighbour approaching me about some noise that I wasn't creating. He didn't feel he couldn't approach me with email. He approached me with an email on the 11th of January. I responded the same morning. I had my manager investigate. We found the problem. It wasn't our problem, but if it was, we would have fixed it. And the problem was resolved. That was a great, that was all of us on the call at the moment. That's a great way of saying that we're open to fixing things. I don't like being doorstepped on the street. And many of these times when I've been less than slightly short-tempered is when people are coming out into the street without making an appointment and using quite aggressive language to me. I'm more than happy to sit down in a meeting with or without mediation. I don't require that, but it can make people feel easier when there's a third neutral party there. And talking, what I don't like is being approached with or without my children, as with my children in one moment, outside my home and my place of business, being asked in quite heated language about a situation that's arisen. I don't think that's the right way of resolving a problem. So, as I said, more than happy to sit down with people, engage over email, less likely to do so over a phone at the moment, just because of the way things are, but always happy to sit down, always happy to email, always happy to have my manager come around in person at shortest notice and try and resolve any situations that come to light. What I don't like, and when I've been not happy, is when I've been approached in the street with my children, with people shouting. One of the neighbours in Derrickett Street, because our bins were not collected by the council, came out and started kicking one of my associates' car wheels in anger. You know, this is the council not collecting the bins. There was a lot of anger with people over COVID. And understandable, people pent up in their homes. They got caught up with things they wouldn't normally notice. But, you know, these are things that shouldn't be a situation of people resorting to violence. It should be that everyone feels they can just sit down and talk normally. The Residents' Association is there for that forum. Off-Broadway's never been raised as an issue. Obviously, I would have absented myself from meetings should it have been raised. But the bar's been open 13 years. The society's been going for 20 more. No one has ever raised my bar as an issue, ever, in the right forum for it, which is the Residents' Association. You know, all these places are there. The right way to fix things is to have a nice, open, grown-up dialogue, which one of the complaints, Mr. Tompkins, and I went through that process last week. It was resolved within a day, and more of issues like that. I have a good working relationship with our rear neighbour now, who's not on this call today, and we seem to be getting on very well. We have had, as I say, issues over people being stuck at home, trying to make conference calls, being tired, being aggravated by the situation. Everyone's a bit tense. We're hoping that, you know, there's supposed to, you know, get a much lighter from Thursday of this week. But I'm always there. I'm always happy to make time. I'm happy to have meetings outside for COVID security. All that's relatively easy to do. So I'm firmly committed. And as I say, I couldn't do more for the market. I sit on endless meetings, both with the council and other local residents and traders. I put countless hours into making the Broadway Market website absolutely brilliant, although I say so myself. I used to run the socials for the market. There's a lot of commitment to the street. I simply don't understand why we weren't able to sit down and talk more sensibly about these issues earlier. I haven't had any direct complaints from the neighbours for a very long period of time, and I'm hoping that most of the issues they had over the COVID trading have gone away. But if there are residual issues, and I'm sure there'll be residual issues, I've lived above a bar for a number of years, we can sit down and resolve them. So it'd be great if we could get that mediation done. The offer remains open for them until someone wants to pick it up.
Thank you. I see that there are a number of hands up. It is getting late, so like Councillor Root to ask a question to Mr. Selby, and then how these meetings work is that we will then move on to what's called a discussion phase. And I hope that may not need to be prolonged, because we have, I think, aired quite a few issues here. But then during that phase, I will bring in all the other people with their hands up. But right now, Councillor Root.
Yeah, mine isn't really a question. It is definitely part of the discussion phase. So shall I just hold on?
Let's kick off well, actually, if you would do so, because what I want to do is just highlight the options open to us. And those options are listed in paragraph 13.2 of the paper. The first option is to take no action. The second option is to modify the conditions of the premises licence. The third is to exclude a licensable activity from the scope of the premises licence. I don't think that's one that we are probably going to contemplate. Option 4 is to remove the designated premises supervisor. 5 is suspend the premises licence for a period not exceeding 3 months. And the sixth option is complete revocation of the licence. So the discussion phase, I think, and indeed in this entire meeting, is intended to help us, Councillor John Thomas, Councillor Root, and myself, to decide which of those options we should choose from, and added to those options, I think we have included the suggestion at the beginning of the meeting for an adjournment to allow the licensing authority and the licensee to decide what, if any, additional conditions should be added to the license in order to address the issues that we've heard here today. So I think that's a bit of scoping for what this discussion is meant to do. And with that, I will hand over to you, Councillor Root.
Thanks. Actually, one of my questions was going to be to the licensing officers about those very things that you've just said. I was just wondering if there is, and I say this not necessarily to say this would be my suggestion in the discussion that we have afterwards, but I'd like to know from the licensing officers whether or not it's possible for us to have a combination of some of those options. So, for example, and again, I say I'm not suggesting this is necessarily what I'm going to suggest, but could we combine option B, option 2, modifying the conditions of the premises license, taking on board what Councillor Peters has just said about the fact that that might need to be done in discussion with both the licensing authority and the police. Would it be possible to combine option 2 with, for example, a short suspension, option 5, whilst those things are thrashed out? Is that something that would be possible or not? And the reason I raise it is because if we haven't discussed it in the open meeting, it's not something that we can discuss in private. So I just want to find out whether or not that is something that's possible or not. So that's a question for the licensing officers. Maybe we can sort that out, and then I can go on and make another couple of points that I want to make.
Yeah, is Ms. Moore on the line?
Sorry, perhaps I could suggest that Amanda would be the best person to qualify to speak on that as the legal advisor.
Yeah, and I was just looking for her on the floor.
She's here. She is here. She's listening. I can see from her face.
Yes, sorry, I heard that. So, so you're asking whether or not we can have a short suspension whilst that's carried out. I'm just conscious that, well, if the parties all agree to that, then I think that should be fine. But I think it is a case that the license holders will need to agree that suspension period, and whether or not it is possible and workable for some progress to be made in that time. I think it will be interesting to hear what the police say about this, because I mean, it's really sort of, I think it is difficult at the moment to ascertain whether or not all the responsible authorities are wanting to go with conditions or revocation, or whether or not they feel mediation and resolving the issues in like a suspension period would be helpful. So because we don't want to suspension if it's not going to be helpful to everybody, and if everyone's not cooperate.
Okay, so PC Ryan, what was your view on this?
I actually think it's a real shame that we haven't had dialogue with Mr. Selby, because it could have been that a conversation or discussions could have had around modifying the conditions. Because I think, as we've heard from the residents, I think modifying some of the conditions could go some way to addressing the concerns that they have. But as we haven't had those conditions and we haven't been able to thrash out any conditions, it's made it very difficult.
So, sorry, through the chair, PC Ryan, are you still then going for revocation, or what other options were you wanting to the members to consider, if not revocation?
It would be modifying the conditions would be our other option.
And the suggestion is that there could be a suspension and perhaps a sort of 3-month suspension, and then an expectation that the licensee could bring that suspension perhaps to an early conclusion by agreeing license conditions that are acceptable to the Metropolitan Police and the licensing authority.
That could be considered, but I'm not sure whether we would be able to come to any agreement. That would be the only issue.
Could I say, as bringing this matter to the committee, I would like to say that I think what I would like, and I know it's quite a tall order for this evening, but at least some firm guidance from the committee as to what conditions they would like to see, perhaps. I don't know if this is possible, and sort of Gareth will explain otherwise. But I think we're in a position whereby we are not looking now for revocation. We are looking for stiff conditions in relation to this trading entity. We want to see compliant premises that is quiet, and that we want residents to know that that's the condition. To go away into a slightly darkened room and agree conditions is a bit of a tall order for us. What we would like, therefore, if that is to be the decision of the committee, to have some very strong guidelines as to what they would expect in relation to any license that would come forward. And I would work with the police I would expect to work with the police on this.
So I think we would also have expected the licensing authority to have come to us and to have explained, given all the evidence of in the report you provided, and indeed the police has provided, as to some solutions here rather than just.
I have offered those in my initial submission.
So sorry. So the suggestions that you gave were removal of off-sales, essentially, including to outside tables, hours reduced to 11 p.m. with closure at 11. Sorry, that wasn't you. That was very well.
I can run through them again if you want, sir.
So reduce external consumption, no open containers being sold, no use of the garden, only seated customers outside and only until 9 p.m. And clarification on smokers. So where did they smoke? They shouldn't be drinking alcohol, and SIA staff should be employed. Those are the conditions that you are suggesting.
Yes, they were. They're not entirely exhaustive because other things have been discussed this evening, but those would be my core submissions. I mean, I think there was some debate as to whether or not the off-sales element of the license could be revoked. But again, that may be mitigated by the fact that we would then place controls on their off sales in any event. But Yes, sorry.
So, Ms. North, before you come in, I just want
Yeah.
so you mentioned that the other issues that have been raised, there are other conditions that have been suggested, such as the removal of live music and the removal of off sales as well. Are those things that you that appear to you to be appropriate?
I was talking mainly, and my focus of the complaint is in relation to the external noises that the quantum of complaints are about. And if we look at those complaints that specifically mention this premises, they tend, and almost all, are concerned with external noise going late into the night, which is disturbing to residents. That is what our concern is principally here. There may well be some individual issues around the edges of that, but however, I do think that those are the ones that we would wish to sort of focus on. And I think Mr. Hughes has to be asked on this matter.
No, I mean he is going to be.
Yes,
so,
sure.
Councillor Root, first though. Sorry. Was it on this point?
It was on this point, really. I mean, it seems to me that I think the license holder has slightly contradictory attitudes on some of what he said to us. I mean, he said, for instance, at one point, he doesn't like to be doorstepped in the street, but he's also said to us that as the chair of the local residents association, he's always out and about and available. So, you know, it seems to me that one of the things that is going to come out of this, if we are to get anywhere, is that we have to have some formalized requirements. There's going to be something of a root and branch review of this license, which is outdated compared to others in the vicinity. And it seems to me that some formalized requirements for how some of this happens in the future is going to be helpful to you, actually. Because you also said there's a right way of to address these things. Well, you may have your right way to address it, and your neighbours may well have their right way to address it. And you know, actually, there is no right way to address these things unless it's set out in the license. And so we need to thrash that out so that some of these things don't happen in the future. I think that's something that the licensee really does need to take on board. And directly what I wanted to ask really was, could the licensee, given what he said, and I am sympathetic also to quite a lot of what you've said, in particular about the barrier. I can see that the barrier is a problem. It becomes a kind of an unofficial bar that people use. It seems to me that the way to work with that is to work with your local councillors to try and sort that out. And given that you've said that you are convinced that the outside drinking and the noise from the outside drinking is not emanating from your premises, I do wonder, therefore, if you know how you would feel about the removal of off sales, because you know if those off sales aren't coming from you, it's not going to make a huge difference to your business, is it? One assumes. So I'd like to hear what your view would be on that, and similarly about the other request from the residents about no outside drinking except soft drinks. Is that something that you could accept? Or are you more minded towards closing the outside drinking in the street at 9 o'clock, as the licensing officer has suggested? I think it would be really useful for us to have a steer from you on those things.
So Mr. Hughes, we'll come to you in a second. Councillor Fajana-Thomas has a point as well.
Thanks, Chair. Similarly, I would like to Mr. Selby, Mr. Hughes, or views around suspension of the license for a period of time. And the other question is to our legal officer around monitoring. There was a suggestion, I'm not too sure if we were from one of the residents or around possible conditions and a period of monitoring, which is not one of the options before us. Is that possible? Is there provision for that legally? Thank you.
No, we've only got the options that are available to us unless one of the responsible authorities are prepared to do this monitoring. So it's a bit onerous, because if we put something like that down, it then creates extra work for both either the police or the licensing authority to undertake that, and they may not have the staff or the manpower to actually do that on a regular basis. That's the only difficulty we have. But it isn't one of the options that we have, as I say, unless one of the parties, you know, the responsible authorities agree to it. But I don't think they will, because I don't think they have the resources for it.
So that seems to be their job in any case. So, so I think it's really unfortunate that we haven't had a set of conditions presented to us that have been negotiated between any of the parties. Sorry, Ms. North.
What I was going to suggest is, what do you think, or what do the parties think about an adjournment?
So yes, so,
to give the parties then a chance, because my only worry with the suspension is that whether everyone's going to be agreeable to it, and whether or not then the license holder will then appeal that.
Yeah, Ms. North, can we hear from Mr. Hughes? So, Mr. Hughes, I think there are two issues here.
Yeah.
There is the issue of how we get from where we are right now somewhere to a certain
Yes.
place. There's that. There's a process point. There's also a bit of substance here, and the substance, I think, is we're starting to coalesce around or we want to think about what, if any additional conditions are put on the license, what those conditions would look like, and what's on the table at the moment, I think, predominantly are reduction of external consumption, as Mr. Gardner has spoken to us about, no open containers outside, no use of the garden for consumption of alcohol, seated customers outside until 9, clarification on smokers and SIA staff and that sort of thing. Ms. Brewer has also spoken about removal of off sales and removal of the live music, which Mr. Gardner didn't think were necessary, but Councillor Root is asking about this idea of off sales being removed. So I'd appreciate your thoughts on both of those things, both the
Thank you
now and what those license conditions might look like.
Yeah, I'm very grateful to you and your colleagues as well for the contemplative way that you're looking at this one, if I may say, and I'm grateful to you all. With regard to your question, Chairman, about paragraph 13.2 and the 6 options laid out for you there, the only 2 that are really mutually exclusive, of course, are A and F. You couldn't do either of those together. You're either revoking or you're taking no action. With regard to the ones in between, B, C, D, and E, you can do all of them if you wish. It's entirely within your power to remove the designated premises supervisor, to change conditions, to exclude licensable activity. You can do any or all 4 of those if you wish to do so. Now, I'm very grateful to some of the officers and Kerry for coming forward with some suggestions about conditions, and that they're now not seeking themselves, I don't think it's what they're saying, a total revocation, because the issue is now more nuanced. And if that's the case, then F probably won't apply. I think that Amanda has come forward with a useful suggestion here, if I may say so, and that is an adjournment. Well, if I may say so, if we were in a normal committee meeting, we'd probably all go into a room now and sort this out. And I've been in thousands of committees where, of course, we've done exactly that, where we all tuck ourselves away to a room and come back in with a nice sheet of conditions for the committee to either agree or disagree with. But at least you've then got a document, Chairman, which you can play around with as members and either tighten up the conditions or water them down as you please. So I think Amanda's come forward with a useful suggestion that we adjourn the meeting. It's entirely up to you to do that if you were in live session anyway, to come back on another day. I think we've got the tenor of the sort of conditions we're looking at. And I get the drift, and I think Mr. Selby does as well. In fact, I think he's suggested a few himself whilst we've been discussing this. So if I may say so, I think Amanda's come forward with the best solution here, which is the adjournment solution, to allow us, Mr. Gardner, myself, Ms. Ryan, and others, to talk about conditions and bring some of the residents in as well on that, of course, and see what we come forward. Then if there's disagreement, I'm sure there'll be conditions we can agree. And then if there are conditions which Mr. Gardner thinks are not weak, or he wants a tighter condition, then we can come in front of you with those conditions, if that's what the committee is minded ultimately to do. And given that I don't think the officers are now seeking revocation, but I hope I haven't misquoted them.
Ms. North.
Yes, I was going to say, if you're considering an adjournment, maybe 4 to 6 weeks, something like that, reasonable, which then also incorporates your availability as well to come back.
And I think it would be helpful during that period as well to take up Mr. Selby on his offer of mediation. Councillor Reid.
I was just going to suggest that in this period, it would be very useful, I think, for Mr. Selby to have a look at some of the recent licenses which have been granted on Broadway Market, so that he can get a sense of the tone and the tenor of those and the concerns that have been raised in those meetings and how they've been addressed. Because I think it would really give you a head start on how you might look at reshaping your license for the future.
It's precisely what I was thinking of, Councillor Root.
Councillor Reid, you seem to be in agreement with this idea of an adjournment. Councillor Fajana-Thomas?
Yes, Chair.
Okay. Before we take any decision now, Ms. Braywood, we've been very patient. Is there something you wanted to add?
Just a few quick points of clarification, if that's okay. I just wanted to point out that there on Derricott Street there are now 19 children living there, 4 of which have been born in the last 3 months. So there are a high number of families living there, many from long-standing and many from not. Also, I'd like to echo Councillor Fajana-Thomas's comments about who can and can't live and what people should put up with and what levels of quality of life they're entitled to have. Well, I'm awfully sorry, but you cannot use the argument that somebody should choose to look around and see what it's like and live there if you're a council tenant or you're a social housing tenant, because 50% of Derricott Street is those properties. And one of those is suffering greatly and doesn't have the option to move or get away or do anything. Also, there is only, as far as I am aware, on the whole of Derricott Street, which is the street right next door to off Broadway, I live at the bottom of that on Croston Street. That is a lady who is actually long-term renting the house that backs over to the garden of off Broadway. So they are points of clarity, because I feel you've been misled. I would also like to point out that, because there were some unpleasant things said about myself, which I feel you need to have a quick redress of. Firstly, the Broadway Market Traders and Residents Association was formed to represent residents, market traders and shop traders. The association has not functioned in any formality since pre-pandemic. The association that Rupert referred to was the Association of Broadway Market Traders, which I helped form, because almost all of the market traders, bar 2, I believe, no longer wished to be under Rupert Selby's guidance. And I have not represented that organisation now for just over a year, because I was only there temporarily to help them get set up at their request. We do have a residents group. It's not a formal association, and all of those represent a large number of residents from all of the surrounding streets and those on Broadway Market, and they do come under our WhatsApp group. So we are very, very much joined up and very much a greater representation. I believe apart from the Selbys themselves, there is only one other resident that's actually officially a member. I think maybe 2, there has been no meetings bar 1 in over 2.5 years. Also, I believe that Mr. Rupert Selby has not spent hardly any residential time in the flat above the property, because he has been away with his family, and he's very rarely there.
So I'm not sure it is helpful to get into a blow by blow.
It was just to clarify points that from that were mainly aimed at me, and misleading you into things, and I felt it was just trying to be a defamation of character.
Yes.
But I also, I will leave that there. Just the other thing is the gates were installed under the hostile vehicle mitigation plan, which I worked very closely with the council on, with many hats on. And they are there for that purpose, to protect the public in the event of an attack.
Yeah.
And so the possibility of having them removed or different things put in place at this point, given council budget, and although I have requested that we possibly look into that by using upright posts, is not an option, as I'm aware at this point. And I know Councillor Vajana Thomas will agree with me on that, because it comes up, especially with budget. On feelings going forward, given what Rupert said, personally, I'm even more concerned. The messages I've come through from many of the people that I'm representing here tonight are very worried. And yes, the strongest thing is that if there are conditions, they truly all believe that off sales would be one of the greatest conditions to actually prevent the outside noise. But we would be, we respect your decision going forward. I don't feel there's much I can say, and it is so late for all of us, bless you all. So I hope you will really consider the impact on residents and the long-term impact of this.
We certainly will, and thank you for that. It is very late, and while we hope to release everyone very soon, the officers, council officers, and the councillors on the call still have to deliberate the first item that we heard this morning. So we will be here for some time yet.
Sorry.
No, there wasn't a criticism of you.
No, I appreciate everybody giving up their time to listen to us. Thank you.
And it's important that we do. Mr. Tompkins, you've had your hand up for some time as well.
Thank you. So I'll be quick. I just wanted to say that I've had no invitations for mediation or to the Residents Association. I've never heard of this Residents Association.
Well,
I have reached out. Yeah, I've reached out to Mr. Selby several times. Last time he did, I acknowledge he did reply. That was the first time, and it was obviously in the week leading up to this meeting that he's responded in a constructive way. But I think, like I said, if you I would argue for revocation, but if you're minded, I would just wanted to add the condition about live music, because although it's said to be sound or insulated, I hear the music in my flat when there's music there, and so no live music or no live music beyond, I don't know, reasonable time, 8-9 p.m. would be my only other request.
So well, hopefully the point about mediation and resident group will change. Ms. North, regulated entertainment, the deregulation of it, meaning that we can't put any restrictions before 11, is that right?
Yes, yeah, that's correct. It's only between 11 and 3 or 11 and 5 in the morning that we then would put any sort of condition on. Yeah.
So Mr. Tompkins, that means that we can't stop them from entertainment. Okay. That's what I'm sorry to say. Mr. Selby, if you could be brief, we would be eternally grateful.
I'm going to be very brief, and I'm not trying to be facetious, but slightly. There's 20 children now, as you just saw, not 19. I'm glad that 19 people living next to my very busy bar chose to have children and raise them there. I really don't think it could be that much of an issue if people have had children in the last 13 years that we've been open. It just can't be an issue that we're stopping people having kids there. It doesn't make sense to me. If all those people have chosen to have kids next to my venue and next to me, Louise is completely right. I have been living apart due to COVID regulations. I'm fully intending to move back into Broadway Market as soon as they allow. The gates, I don't know what meeting Louise is at about the security gates, and I'll keep this very brief. They're not security rated. They're nothing to do with the defence system. Hackney Council merely needed somewhere to put them to deter people. They're not part of any security deterrent, and I'd love them to be removed, but that's not part of this meeting. And I'm not going to talk about music because, as you said, there's nothing that can be done there. So that's fine. I won't talk to it.
Thank you very much. So I think, unless Mr. Hughes wants to sum up, and I don't think there's a need, is there? No? Wonderful. Councillor Root, Councillor Fajana Thomas, sorry, Ms North.
I was just going to say, if you are going for adjournment, we won't be able to confirm the date today. The licensing authority will confirm once they've found another date that this matter can be adjourned to, then they'll notify everyone.
Okay, and the suggestion I think is that there's an adjournment to allow time for additional conditions to be drafted and added to, agreed to be added to the licence, and that process should involve some form of meeting, whether it be mediation or however that is framed with residents, but certainly involving residents, the applicant, the licensing authority, and the Metropolitan Police. So I suspect that will take at least six or so weeks to arrange. Councillor Root, Councillor Fajana Thomas, are we happy to adjourn the hearing of this application along those lines?
Thanks, Chair. I'm happy for us to adjourn, but just before we do that, just a point of clarification in terms of drafting the conditions we are bringing back to the committee. From Amanda, during this drafting of the conditions, would Mr. Selby need to agree? Would that be condition that are agreed to both by the police, the licensing authority, and Mr. Selby?
Yes,
would
no,
that
the whole point of this adjournment is for all parties to, including Mr. Selby or the licence holders, together with his legal representative if needed, you know, to actually discuss these conditions, etc. This is something that should have probably been done prior to this meeting, but unfortunately it wasn't possible for whatever reason. And so they do need to do that, and he does need to participate and come back. And these proposed conditions, hopefully he would be in agreement with them in some form. If he isn't, then equally the responsible authorities can still submit them to us, and it would be at their members' discretion whether or not they choose to accept those conditions with or without Mr. Selby's agreement.
okay? Yeah, that is the final part of my question. Is what if there wasn't, or there's no agreement to those conditions? What happened when we come back, and how do we treat that? Do we revert back to revocation of license, or where would that point take us?
Yes, I mean, basically you still will have your options as set out in the papers today to consider, and it will be at your discretion whether or not you accept all those conditions to tighten up the license, or whether or not you choose one of the other options. You'll still have all your options available to you, plus all the conditions that are being considered in the intervening period. But we hope obviously that the license holder will participate in this fully and do everything that they can to try and resolve the issues, in light of the fact that revocation is not possibly being considered now. But obviously that will be confirmed by the next hearing.
Okay,
sorry, would it not be possible to say that in fact all options, if we were to return without agreement, all options would still be available to
Yes, that's what I meant. Sorry, that's what I meant.
Including
Yes, there would be. There would be, Robert. Yeah.
So, right, I think we've agreed we're going to adjourn. We've got an indication from the licensing authority as to what those conditions should look like, and we should also include consideration of prohibiting off sales, and have something about the preventing noise from emanating from the premises and the neighbouring premises. In any case, thank you very much, and we or another subcommittee will consider this in about 6 weeks' time, or at a date notified by the council.
I hope it'll be the same committee, if I may say so, because we have to go through all the arguments again if it's a different one and start again.
Yes, that's why I said 6 weeks, just to make sure that the availability is there potentially.
Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, in which case, I will call this meeting to a close, albeit the councillors should remain on the call.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, committee.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.